Hi everyone, welcome back to the Red Umbrella channel. I hope you're all doing well. Today we'll be looking at 2 hours of dark Peter Griffin lore to fall asleep to. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough of that, let's begin. First up, we've got the mystery of Peter's childhood trauma under Francis and Karen Griffin. Peter Griffin grew up in a house where love came with conditions and pain came without warning. His childhood in Providence, Rhode Island was shaped by two people who made his early years difficult in very different ways. Francis Griffin, the man Peter believed was his father for most of his life, was a devout Irish Catholic who ran his home like a military base mixed with a church. Karen Griffin, Peter's older sister, saw her younger brother as a target for constant abuse and humiliation. Between them, they created an environment where Peter learned that family members could hurt you, and nobody would stop it from happening. Francis Griffin was born in 1928 and served as a World War II veteran before settling down to work at the Pawtucket Mill. He was the kind of man who believed work was sacred and rest was sinful. His faith defined everything about how he lived and how he expected others to live around him. When Francis looked at Peter, he saw failure and disappointment. This harsh view colored every interaction between father and son throughout Peter's childhood and into his adult years. Francis made it clear through his words and actions that Peter did not measure up to his standards. The relationship between Francis and Peter was cold from the start. Francis brought a level of strictness to parenting that went beyond normal discipline. He treated Peter's childhood as something that needed to be controlled and corrected rather than nurtured. Francis believed strongly in Catholic teachings and forced these beliefs onto his family with an iron fist. He did not tolerate questioning or defiance. When Peter was young, Francis would criticize him for the smallest mistakes and never seemed satisfied with anything his son did. In one specific instance from Peter's adult life, Francis came to live with the Griffin family after being forced to retire from the Pawtucket Mill. During this visit, Francis showed exactly how he treated family members. He yelled at Peter's son Chris for what he thought was inappropriate behavior in the bathroom when the boy was simply using the toilet normally. He made Peter's daughter Meg feel guilty for holding hands with a neighbor boy, telling her she was committing a sin. He told Peter's youngest son Stewie bedtime stories about the punishments waiting for sinners in hell, filling the baby's mind with images of eternal suffering. When Francis got a job at the happy-go-lucky toy factory where Peter worked, things got even worse. Francis displayed excellent work skills and quickly became foreman of the factory. His first major decision in this new position was to fire his own son. Francis told Peter in front of all his co-workers that he was a failure as both a worker and a father. He called Peter out publicly and humiliated him in his own workplace. Then Francis fired Peter on the spot and slapped him across the face when Peter tried to defend himself. This moment showed how Francis saw his role as a father, not as a source of support or encouragement, but as someone whose job was to point out every flaw and punish every shortcoming. The abuse Peter suffered from Francis went beyond just harsh words and public humiliation. Years later, when Peter was an adult and went on a couples retreat in the Bahamas with his wife Lois, something triggered a repressed memory. Peter tried to hit himself on the head with a coconut because he wanted to forget about being tricked into attending marriage counseling. The coconut gave him a bloody head injury, but instead of erasing his memory like he hoped, the impact brought back something he had buried deep in his mind. Peter suddenly remembered that he was abused by his dad during his childhood. The specific details of this abuse were not shown on screen, but the fact that Peter had repressed these memories so deeply that they only came back through head trauma suggests the abuse was severe and traumatic. Francis never expressed warmth or affection toward Peter in the normal ways fathers show love to their sons. Even when Francis claimed to love Peter, he always added qualifiers. He would say things like he loved Peter but did not like him. He loved Peter but disapproved of his choices. He loved Peter but thought he was a disappointment. This conditional love created a situation where Peter constantly sought his father's approval but could never actually earn it. No matter what Peter did or how hard he tried, Francis found reasons to criticize and reject him. The relationship reached its end at Meg's birthday party. Peter dressed up as a drunken clown character and attempted to ride a unicycle down the staircase. He fell off the unicycle while drunk and landed directly on Francis, crushing him. The injuries were severe. Francis suffered crushed ribs, a busted spleen, and a punctured lung. As Francis lay dying in the hospital, his final words to Peter were not words of love or forgiveness. Instead, Francis used his last breath to insult his son one more time. He looked at Peter and said, "Peter was a fat, stinking drunk." Those were the last words Peter ever heard from the man he believed was his father his entire life. After Francis died, Peter went to see a hypnotherapist to deal with his grief and complicated feelings about his father. During the therapy session, Peter recovered a memory that changed everything he thought he knew about his family. The memory showed Francis explicitly telling young Peter that he was not his biological father. Francis had known all along that Peter was not his son. Peter's mother Thelma had an affair with an Irish man named Mickey McFinnigan, and Peter was the result of that affair. Francis raised Peter anyway, but he did it with resentment and coldness. Francis treated Peter harshly partly because Peter was a constant reminder that Thelma had been unfaithful to him. This revelation explained some of Francis's behavior but did not excuse it. Francis chose to raise Peter as his son, but he also chose to make Peter's childhood miserable. He could have treated Peter with kindness despite knowing the truth about his parentage, but instead he used that truth as justification for being cold and abusive. The fact that Francis was not Peter's biological father became another layer of trauma in Peter's already complicated childhood. While Francis provided one source of trauma, Peter's sister Karen provided another. Karen Griffin was born 8 years before Peter to Francis and a previous wife. When Francis's first marriage ended in divorce, he got custody of Karen. This meant that when Peter was born and Francis married Peter's mother Thelma, Karen was already part of the family dynamic. From the very beginning, Karen saw Peter as someone to torment rather than a brother to protect or care for. Karen was a bully in the truest sense of the word. She did not just tease Peter occasionally or have normal sibling conflicts with him. Karen went out of her way to make Peter's life miserable through consistent physical and emotional abuse. She would beat Peter up regularly. She would fart directly in his face as a form of humiliation. She would embarrass him in front of other people by revealing his secrets and mocking his weaknesses. Karen treated Peter as a target for her aggression and seemed to enjoy making him suffer. The most damaging aspect of Karen's bullying was not just what she did to Peter, but what Francis and Thelma chose not to do about it. Peter's parents stood by and watched Karen abuse their son. They did not intervene to stop the bullying. They did not punish Karen for her behavior. They did not protect Peter from his own sister. This parental neglect taught Peter two terrible lessons. First, he learned that the adults who were supposed to protect him would not actually do so when he needed them. Second, he learned that his suffering did not matter enough for anyone to take action. When Karen came to visit the Griffin household as an adult for Thanksgiving dinner, she immediately reverted to her old patterns of behavior. The moment she saw Peter, she greeted him by farting in his face, just like she had done when they were children. During dinner, Karen told embarrassing stories from their childhood that humiliated Peter in front of his friends and family. She revealed details about Peter wetting his pants and wearing a bra and other personal information meant to make him look foolish and weak. During a family football game on Thanksgiving, Karen showed the full extent of her bullying. She knocked Peter almost unconscious with a hard tackle. Then she put him in her signature wrestling move called the toxic shock, wrapping her legs around his neck and choking him until he passed out. The other family members watched this happen and did nothing to help Peter until it was too late. This mirrored exactly what had happened during their childhood. Karen hurting Peter while everyone else stood by and watched. Peter's daughter Meg eventually confronted him about the connection between his childhood and his behavior toward her. Meg pointed out that Karen treated Peter exactly the same way Peter treated Meg. The bullying, the humiliation, the casual cruelty. Peter was repeating the same patterns with his own daughter that his sister had used on him. When Meg made this connection clear, Peter admitted the truth. He told Meg that Karen had bullied him throughout their childhood, and that their parents, Francis and Thelma, had done nothing to stop it. Peter explained that his reasons for bullying Meg all these years came directly from the abuse he suffered from Karen. This admission was significant because it showed Peter understood the cycle of abuse he was perpetuating. He knew where his behavior came from. He knew it was wrong. But knowing the source of his problems did not automatically fix them. The damage done to Peter during his childhood had become so deeply ingrained in his personality that he repeated the same patterns with his own children without even thinking about it. Thelma, Peter's mother, contributed to his traumatic childhood through neglect rather than active abuse. Thelma was a heavy drinker and gambler who often put her own desires ahead of her son's needs. She would throw whiskey bottles at Peter. She would leave him alone with Francis for days at a time while she went to Las Vegas to gamble. These actions showed that while Thelma may have loved Peter in her own way, she was not capable of being the protective parent he needed. Thelma's neglect was different from Francis's abuse, but it was just as damaging. Peter had one parent who actively made his life difficult, and another parent who was too focused on her own problems to notice or care when he needed help. This combination left Peter without any safe adults to turn to during his childhood. He had no one defending him from Karen's bullying. He had no one protecting him from Francis's harsh treatment. He was alone in a house full of family members who either hurt him or ignored his pain. The long-term effects of this childhood shaped everything about who Peter became as an adult. His relationship with his own children reflected the patterns he learned growing up. His treatment of Meg especially mirrored the way Karen treated him. The casual cruelty, the public humiliation, The sense that one family member could be designated as the acceptable target for everyone else's frustration and anger. Peter learned from his childhood that this was normal family behavior. Peter's desperate need for approval and attention also came from his childhood experiences. Because Francis never gave him the validation he craved, Peter spent his adult life seeking approval from others in increasingly ridiculous ways. He would make grand gestures and create elaborate schemes to prove his worth because he never learned that he had inherent value as a person. Francis taught him that love had to be earned through achievement and that failure meant you deserved contempt. The abuse Peter suffered also affected his emotional development in ways that made him seem childish and immature as an adult. People who experience trauma during childhood often struggle with emotional regulation and impulse control. Peter's impulsive behavior, his inability to think through consequences, his tendency to react emotionally rather than logically, all of these traits can be linked back to a childhood where he learned that the world was unpredictable and often painful. When children grow up without stable, supportive parents, they often develop coping mechanisms that look like immaturity to outside observers. Peter's relationship with alcohol also connected to his childhood trauma. Francis's final words calling Peter a fat, stinking drunk were proven accurate in a way Francis probably intended as pure insult. Peter did develop a serious drinking problem as an adult. This drinking served multiple purposes in Peter's life. It helped him avoid thinking about painful memories. It gave him confidence he lacked when sober. It provided an excuse for behavior he knew was wrong but felt compelled to do anyway. The fact that Peter's heavy drinking bothered Francis created a twisted form of rebellion where Peter could prove his father right while also defying him. The revelation that Francis was not Peter's biological father added another layer of complexity to the trauma. Peter had spent his entire childhood trying to earn love and approval from a man who resented his very existence. Every harsh word from Francis, every punishment, every moment of coldness, all of it came from a man who knew Peter was not his son, but raised him anyway with bitterness rather than grace. This knowledge would have been devastating for Peter to process because it meant his childhood suffering had an explanation but not a justification. Understanding that his trauma came from specific sources did not heal Peter or change his behavior automatically. The patterns established in childhood become deeply embedded in how a person thinks and acts. Peter's brain learned during his formative years that family relationships involve pain, that love comes with conditions, that seeking approval is more important than self-respect, and that the cycle of abuse is normal. Even when Peter intellectually understood these lessons were wrong, his emotional responses and automatic behaviors still followed the patterns burned into his mind during childhood. The story of Peter's childhood trauma shows how abuse gets passed down through generations. Francis likely learned his harsh parenting style from his own father. Karen's bullying behavior came from her own experiences and her resentment about her parents' divorce. Peter then passed his learned behaviors on to Meg. Each generation carries forward the damage done to them unless someone makes a conscious effort to break the cycle. In Peter's case, while he gained awareness of where his problems came from, he struggled to actually change his behavior in meaningful ways. This pattern of childhood trauma explains much about Peter Griffin as a character. His desperate need for attention, his childish behavior, his bullying of Meg, his drinking problem, his constant seeking of approval, all of these traits connect back to a childhood where he learned that the world was harsh, that family members could hurt you without consequence, and that his own worth was always in question. The trauma inflicted by Francis and Karen, combined with the neglect from Thelma, created the person Peter became. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have the fact of how Peter turned Meg into the family's punching bag. Peter Griffin did not become a bad father to Meg Griffin overnight. The pattern developed gradually over years, starting from small moments of neglect and building into systematic abuse that turned his eldest daughter into what the show itself acknowledges as the family punching bag. The transformation happened through repeated choices Peter made to use Meg as an outlet for his own frustrations, a target for cheap laughs, and a person whose feelings simply did not matter in the Griffin household. The foundation for this dynamic was established early in Meg's life. In the episode Lethal Weapons, the family tried an anger management technique where they wrote letters to each other expressing their feelings but never sent them. Meg discovered Peter's letter to her, which revealed something shocking about how her father viewed her. The letter stated that for the first 4 years of Meg's life, Peter genuinely believed she was a house cat. This was not presented as a joke Peter was making. This was what Peter actually thought. He looked at his infant and toddler daughter and somehow confused her with a household pet for years. This confusion about Meg's basic humanity set the tone for everything that followed. Peter never fully corrected his thinking. Even after realizing Meg was his daughter and not a cat, he continued treating her as less than fully human. He treated her as something between a family member and a disposable object that existed for his convenience or amusement. The letter revealed that Peter's mistreatment of Meg was not just about teenage rebellion or normal parent-child conflict. It started when Meg was a helpless child who depended completely on her parents for survival and love. Peter's catchphrase toward Meg became, "Shut up, Meg." This two-word dismissal appeared across countless episodes and became one of the most recognizable running gags in the entire series. Whenever Meg tried to speak, whenever she attempted to contribute to family conversations, whenever she expressed an opinion or feeling, Peter would cut her off with these two words. The phrase was not limited to moments when Meg was being annoying or inappropriate. Peter used it constantly, turning it into an automatic response to his daughter's very existence. Other family members picked up the phrase and began using it themselves, but Peter originated it and used it most frequently. The physical abuse Peter inflicted on Meg went far beyond normal parental discipline. In the episode Peter's Daughter, Peter nearly killed Meg through his selfishness during a flood. When floodwaters filled the Griffin house and the family needed to evacuate, Peter insisted that Meg go into the flooded kitchen to retrieve beer and a sandwich for him. The refrigerator was mostly underwater. Meg was forced to dive down and hold her breath to get these items for her father. Her blouse snagged on one of the refrigerator racks, and she became trapped underwater. She began drowning while Peter waited above for his beer. Peter eventually went into the kitchen and pulled her out, but she was already unconscious and fell into a coma. While Meg lay in the hospital in that coma, Peter reflected on the terrible things he had done to his daughter over the years. The episode showed a montage of Peter's abusive behavior. The images included Peter tripping Meg deliberately to make her fall, Peter flicking Meg's nose hard with his finger as she walked by, Peter shooting Meg with an actual firearm, Peter wiping a booger from his nose onto Meg's hat while telling her he was proud of her. These were not isolated incidents that Peter regretted. These were deliberate pranks that Peter remembered fondly and found amusing, even as his daughter lay unconscious in a hospital bed because of his negligence. The shooting incident deserves special attention because it represents one of the most extreme acts of violence Peter committed against Meg. According to the show's wiki and multiple episode references, Peter actually shot his daughter with a gun at some point. The specific episode and circumstances are referenced in Peter's Daughter when he reflects on his past behavior. This was not a paintball gun or toy gun. This was an actual firearm that Peter discharged at his teenage daughter. The fact that this event is mentioned casually alongside other pranks suggests it was treated as normal behavior in the Griffin household, rather than the attempted murder it would be considered in reality. Peter's abuse was not limited to occasional violent outbursts. He engaged in systematic degradation of Meg through daily humiliations. In multiple episodes, Peter would fart directly in Meg's face as a form of greeting or punishment. This happened in The Tan Aquatic with Steve Zissou, where Peter shoved Meg's face into his rear end and then farted on her. It happened again in Bango Was His Name, where Peter claimed to be teaching Meg how to endure a boyfriend's farts by trapping her in a car with his fart and refusing to let her out. It happened yet again in Call Girl, where Peter's parting gift to Meg before she left was releasing a slow fart directly into her face. The repetition of this specific form of abuse shows it was a regular part of how Peter interacted with his daughter. Peter threw food at Meg on multiple occasions. He would throw her dinner in her face during family meals. He threw glasses of milk in her face. He took items meant to nourish his daughter and used them as weapons to humiliate her. These incidents happened during normal family dinners, turning what should have been bonding time into opportunities for abuse. The rest of the family witnessed these attacks and did nothing to stop them. In fact, other family members often laughed or joined in the mockery. The financial neglect Peter showed toward Meg revealed how little he valued her future. Peter admitted in one episode that Meg had not received her mumps vaccination because he didn't love her enough to spend money protecting her from disease. When Peter's father Francis visited and Peter caught the mumps, Peter deliberately exposed Meg to the disease. He forced Meg to stand directly next to an infected person at a Star Trek convention so Peter could take a photograph, knowing this would likely give Meg the mumps. When Meg did catch the disease, Peter refused to give Francis protective equipment, hoping Francis would also get sick. Peter said getting Francis sick would be the only good thing Meg was good for. Peter spent Meg's college fund on a show camel. He took the money that was supposed to secure his daughter's educational future and used it to buy an animal for entertainment purposes. When Meg recovered from the mumps and Peter realized she would still need college money, he showed no remorse about the camel purchase. He simply accepted that Meg would have no way to pay for college because Peter's momentary desire for a camel was more important than Meg's entire future. In one episode, Peter literally sold Meg to the Goldman family. The exact circumstances are referenced across multiple sources, confirming that Peter gave up custody of his daughter in exchange for something he wanted from Mort Goldman's family. Peter treated his daughter as property he could trade away rather than as a person with rights and feelings. Peter asked God to remove Meg from existence. In the episode 3 Acts of God, Peter gained the ability to make requests directly to God. One of his wishes was for God to erase Meg from reality completely. Peter wanted his daughter to stop existing. This was not a joke Peter made in anger that he immediately regretted. This was something Peter genuinely requested when given the power to change anything about his life. The episode Dial Meg for Murder showed perhaps the most sustained sequence of physical abuse Peter inflicted on Meg. Peter learned about an upcoming rodeo competition and decided to enter. Instead of finding proper equipment or practicing at a facility, Peter chose to practice his rodeo skills on his daughter. While Meg slept in her bed, Peter lassoed her from across the room. The rope tightened around her body and Peter violently dragged her from her bed, down the stairs and outside. Peter then attempted to brand Meg with a hot iron the way cowboys brand cattle. He treated his daughter exactly as he would treat livestock. This sustained sequence of violence was not triggered by anything Meg did. She was simply sleeping when Peter decided to use her as practice equipment. Peter's abuse affected how others in the family treated Meg. When the entire Griffin family gathered in Meg's bedroom to read her diary aloud for entertainment, Peter led this invasion of privacy. The family huddled together, laughing at Meg's private thoughts and feelings. When Meg caught them in the act, they continued reading rather than apologizing or showing any shame. Peter had established that Meg's privacy, dignity, and feelings were not worthy of respect, and the rest of the family followed his lead. Peter literally handed viewers the television remote control during one episode after announcing the episode would focus on Meg. This moment broke the fourth wall to tell the audience that even Peter himself found Meg so boring and worthless that he was giving viewers permission to change the channel rather than watch content about his daughter. Peter was telling millions of viewers that his own child was not worth anyone's time or attention. Peter told Meg directly that her birth was a disappointment. This was not something Peter thought privately. He said this to Meg's face. He wanted his daughter to know that from the moment she was born, she had failed to meet his expectations and he wished she had never existed. The connection between Peter's childhood trauma and his treatment of Meg was finally acknowledged in the episode Peter's Sister. When Peter's sister Karen visited for Thanksgiving, she immediately began bullying and abusing Peter in front of his family. She farted in his face as a greeting. She beat him up during a football game. She embarrassed him with stories from their childhood. Meg recognized that Karen treated Peter exactly the way Peter treated Meg. The abuse Karen inflicted on Peter throughout his childhood taught him that this was how family members could behave toward each other. When Peter needed someone to take out his pain and frustration on, he chose the family member most similar to his position in his own childhood family, the daughter who occupied the same powerless position young Peter had occupied. Peter admitted to Meg during this episode that his parents Francis and Thelma had stood by and let Karen abuse him. They watched their daughter hurt their son and did nothing to stop it. This taught Peter that parents allowing abuse was normal family behavior. So when Peter abused Meg, and Lois or other family members witnessed it without intervening, Peter was simply replicating the family dynamic he learned as a child. The cycle of abuse passed directly from Karen to Peter to Meg. The physical violence Peter used against Meg was extensive. Beyond the shooting and the rodeo incident, Peter hit Meg while on steroids in The Father, the Son, and the Holy Fawns. Peter chained Meg up in the cellar in Mind Over Murder. Peter set Meg's hat on fire while she was wearing it. Peter trapped Meg in enclosed spaces with his farts and refused to let her escape until she was choking and gagging. These were not accidents or moments when Peter lost control. These were deliberate acts of cruelty that Peter planned and executed while fully aware of what he was doing. Peter's verbal abuse was constant and pervasive. Beyond "shut up, Meg," Peter regularly called Meg ugly, stupid, worthless, and disappointing. He compared her negatively to objects and animals. He told her that he wished she had never been born. He reminded her frequently that she was the least loved member of the family. He made it clear that if the family had to choose between saving Meg and saving any other family member, they would always let Meg die. The most disturbing aspect of Peter's treatment of Meg was his complete lack of empathy for her suffering. When Meg showed signs of distress, pain, or sadness because of Peter's abuse, Peter either ignored her feelings completely or found them amusing. He laughed when Meg cried. He smiled when she was in physical pain. He expressed satisfaction when his insults landed hard enough to visibly hurt her. Peter was not abusing Meg despite her suffering. In many cases, Peter was abusing Meg specifically to cause suffering because he found that suffering entertaining. Peter never apologized meaningfully for any of this abuse. Even in Peter's daughter, when he promised to treat Meg better after she fell into a coma, his improved behavior lasted only for that single episode. By the next episode, Peter had reverted to his normal pattern of abuse. The apology and promise were meaningless because Peter had no intention of actually changing his behavior permanently. The abuse escalated over the course of the series. In early seasons, Peter's mistreatment of Meg was more subtle, forgetting about her, dismissing her concerns, or making cruel jokes. As the show continued, the abuse became more overt and violent. By later seasons, Peter was physically attacking Meg with regularity, denying her basic needs and dignity, and openly expressing his wish that she would disappear or die. The pattern showed that Peter did not improve as a father over time. Instead, he became progressively worse as he faced no consequences for his actions and received positive reinforcement from his friends and family who laughed at his mistreatment of Meg. Peter turned Meg into the family punching bag through thousands of small cruelties and dozens of major acts of abuse. He established early that Meg's needs did not matter. He taught the rest of the family that Meg could be mocked, ignored, hurt, and degraded without consequence. He modeled the behavior he wanted others to follow, and they followed it. By the time Meg was a teenager, the pattern was so established that everyone in her life treated her as less than human. Peter built this dynamic deliberately through consistent choices to hurt his daughter rather than love her, to mock her rather than support her, and to use her as an outlet for his own pain rather than break the cycle of abuse he experienced as a child. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the fact that Peter's canon IQ is legally too low for him to raise his own kids. Peter Griffin's intelligence became a matter of legal record in the Season 4 episode Petarded, when he took an official IQ test and received results that changed his entire family's life. The episode showed that Peter's mental capacity was not just low by normal standards, but actually fell into the range that qualified him as intellectually disabled under official medical classifications. This diagnosis had immediate legal consequences that resulted in Child Protective Services removing his 3 children from his custody because the state determined Peter was mentally unfit to raise them without supervision. The situation began during a game night at the Griffin house. Peter invited his neighbors over to play Trivial Pursuit with his family. During the game, Lois secretly switched Peter's question cards with ones from the preschool edition of the game. This meant Peter was answering extremely easy questions designed for very young children, while everyone else answered normal adult questions. Peter did not notice the switch. He genuinely believed he was playing the same game as everyone else and succeeding through his own intelligence. When Peter won the game, he became insufferably arrogant. He started talking down to everyone around him. He acted superior to his wife, his friends, and his neighbors. Peter genuinely believed the rigged game proved he was smarter than all of them. He bragged constantly about his victory and treated other people as though they were stupid compared to him. His behavior became so obnoxious that his friend Brian decided to take action. Brian was tired of Peter's gloating and arrogance. He challenged Peter to prove his intelligence through an official test. Brian told Peter about the MacArthur Fellows Program, which offered a grant to proven geniuses. Brian suggested Peter take the test to qualify for this grant and prove he was actually as smart as he claimed. Peter agreed because he was completely confident in his own intelligence after winning at Trivial Pursuit. Peter went to take the MacArthur Fellows Program test. He sat down expecting to prove he was a genius and win money from the grant. Instead, the test revealed the truth about Peter's cognitive abilities. When the results came back, they showed Peter was not a genius at all. In fact, the results showed Peter scored approximately 70 on the IQ test. This score placed him in the range officially classified as intellectually disabled. The technical term used at the time was mentally retarded, though this terminology has since been updated to intellectually disabled or intellectually challenged. Peter sank into depression when he learned about his diagnosis. Being publicly labeled as intellectually disabled devastated him. He had believed he was smart, and now official medical testing proved he was actually far below average intelligence. Peter felt humiliated and sad. He had to process the reality that his brain simply did not work the way normal brains worked. While driving home with Lois after receiving his test results, Peter accidentally hit news anchor Tom Tucker with his car. Tucker was knocked down and injured. He was angry at first and ready to press charges against Peter for hitting him with a vehicle. Then Tucker recognized Peter as the man who had just been declared intellectually disabled. Tucker's attitude changed completely. He decided not to call the police or press any charges. Tucker let Peter go without any consequences because Peter was intellectually disabled. This incident taught Peter something important about his new diagnosis. Peter realized that being officially classified as intellectually disabled meant he could get away with things that would normally get him in trouble. People would not hold him accountable for his actions because of his mental disability. Peter decided to take advantage of this situation as much as possible. Peter began doing whatever he wanted without caring about rules or social norms. He kicked open the stall doors in women's bathrooms while women were using them. He went into restaurants and grabbed the microphone to yell testicles over the loudspeaker to all the customers. He attended church services and threw Bibles at other people who were trying to worship. He finished eating dinner at restaurants and then smashed all his plates on the floor. Nobody stopped him or punished him for any of these behaviors because they all knew he was intellectually disabled. Peter took his exploitation of his diagnosis even further when he decided to steal a deep fryer from a fast food restaurant. He attempted to take the entire frying machine out of the restaurant. The deep fryer was still full of hot cooking grease when Peter tried to steal it. While Peter was carrying the fryer, he poured the hot grease all over his wife, Lois. The burning grease covered Lois and caused severe burns across her body. The grease was hot enough to cause serious injuries that required immediate medical attention. Lois was rushed to the hospital. Her burns were so severe that she needed to stay in the hospital for extended treatment and recovery. This meant Peter would be home alone taking care of their 3 children without Lois there to help or supervise. Meg, Chris, and Stewie would be entirely under Peter's care while Lois recovered from the burns Peter had caused. Child Protective Services became involved because of the situation. An agent named Agent Jessup evaluated the Griffin family situation. The facts were clear. Peter had been officially diagnosed as intellectually disabled. Peter had injured his wife through reckless behavior that came directly from exploiting his disability status. Peter had demonstrated through multiple public incidents that he had no judgment, impulse control, or ability to understand consequences. Lois was in the hospital, unable to care for the children. This meant the children would be left alone with Peter as their only parent. Agent Jessup made an official determination that Peter was mentally unfit to be a single parent. This was not a statement that Peter could never parent under any circumstances. It was a specific ruling that Peter could not safely care for children on his own without another capable adult present. With Lois in the hospital, there was no other capable adult in the Griffin household. The children needed a safe home with proper supervision while their mother recovered. Child Protective Services removed Meg, Chris, and Stewie from Peter's custody. The children were taken out of their home and placed with a temporary guardian. The guardian chosen was Cleveland Brown, one of Peter's neighbors and friends. Cleveland was deemed a responsible and capable adult who could provide proper care for the children until Lois recovered and the family situation stabilized. The children went to live at Cleveland's house. Cleveland proved to be a good foster parent. He took care of the Griffin children responsibly and made sure they were safe and properly supervised. The children were adjusting to their temporary living situation while waiting for their mother to get better and come home. Peter did not accept this situation calmly. He wanted his children back immediately. Brian told Peter that to regain custody, Peter needed to prove to Child Protective Services that he was actually a good parent capable of caring for children. Peter completely misunderstood what this meant. Instead of trying to demonstrate his own parenting abilities, Peter decided the best strategy was to make Cleveland look like a bad parent by comparison. Peter came up with a plan to frame Cleveland as an unfit guardian. Peter brought 7 prostitutes to Cleveland's house while Agent Jessup was scheduled to visit. Peter arranged for the prostitutes to be there when Cleveland arrived home, hoping it would look like Cleveland had invited prostitutes into his home while caring for children. Peter believed this would prove Cleveland was a bad parent and force Child Protective Services to give the children back to Peter. The plan failed immediately. Agent Jessup saw through Peter's obvious setup. Cleveland also recognized exactly what Peter was trying to do. Cleveland was angry at Peter for attempting to frame him after Cleveland had done Peter the favor of taking care of his children. Cleveland ordered Peter to leave his house. He also told 5 of the 7 prostitutes to leave. Cleveland kept 2 of the prostitutes for himself, revealing he was willing to take advantage of the situation, even though he was angry at Peter for creating it. Peter's failed attempt to frame Cleveland made his custody situation worse rather than better. He had now demonstrated additional poor judgment and manipulative behavior. Child Protective Services had even more evidence that Peter made bad decisions and could not be trusted with children. Peter was given a trial to determine whether he should get custody of his children back. This was Peter's opportunity to make his case to a judge. Peter could have used this trial to show genuine remorse, explain how he would change his behavior, or demonstrate understanding of why his actions were wrong. Instead, Peter tried to use unconventional courtroom tactics that made him look even worse. During the trial, Peter attempted to call a surprise witness. He claimed there was a ghost in the courtroom that never lied and could testify on his behalf. Peter said only he could see and hear this ghost. The judge somehow allowed this bizarre testimony to proceed. Even with Peter making up testimony from an imaginary ghost, he still managed to incriminate himself. The testimony Peter claimed the ghost was giving actually made Peter look worse. Peter gave a heartfelt plea to the judge asking for custody of his children. He complained that he was getting unfair treatment because of his intellectual disability. He asked for a second chance to prove he could be a good father. The judge rejected Peter's plea completely. The judge pointed out that Peter's problems went beyond just being intellectually disabled. The judge stated that Peter had consistently used his disability as an excuse to behave like a jerk and hurt other people. Peter had deliberately taken advantage of his diagnosis to avoid consequences. Peter had injured his wife through reckless behavior. Peter had tried to frame an innocent man with prostitutes. The judge concluded that Peter was not just intellectually challenged, but was also a monster. Peter barely avoided being sent to prison. The judge denied his custody request. Peter returned home without his children. He and Brian sat together lamenting the fact that the Griffin family would never be together again. Peter had lost custody permanently as far as he knew. He had failed at trial. He had no other legal options. The children would remain with Cleveland indefinitely while Peter lived alone in his house without his family. Then Lois walked through the door. She had completely recovered from her burns and been released from the hospital. Because Lois was healthy and home, the original reason for removing the children no longer applied. Lois was the capable adult who could supervise Peter and care for the children. She went to Child Protective Services and successfully regained custody of Meg, Chris, and Stewie. The children came home. Peter was overjoyed that everything had returned to normal. His family was back together. The custody crisis was over. As a side effect of the hot grease burns, Lois would smell like French fries for the next 6 months. But otherwise, the family situation had been restored to how it was before Peter took the IQ test. The episode revealed several important facts about Peter's mental capacity that carried forward into the rest of the series. Peter's IQ score of approximately 70 placed him in the range that qualified as intellectually disabled under medical classifications used at the time. This meant Peter's numerous stupid decisions and poor judgment throughout the series had a medical explanation. Peter was not just acting dumb or making bad choices. His brain literally functioned at a level below normal intelligence. His cognitive abilities were impaired to a degree that would qualify him for legal protections and accommodations under disability law. The episode also showed that Peter's intellectual disability made him legally unfit to parent children on his own, without another capable adult present. This was an official determination made by Child Protective Services based on Peter's diagnosis and behavior. The state removed his children from his custody because the government determined Peter could not safely care for children by himself. Only Lois's presence in the household made it legally acceptable for the children to live with Peter. The diagnosis explained many of Peter's characteristics shown throughout the series: his short attention span, his inability to understand consequences, his impulsive behavior, his difficulty learning from mistakes, his poor judgment, and his childish reactions to situations all stemmed from his cognitive impairment. Peter's brain was not capable of the planning, reasoning, and impulse control that normal adults use to navigate life safely. The episode demonstrated that even after being told he was intellectually disabled, Peter did not gain any insight or improve his behavior. He immediately exploited his diagnosis for personal gain. When that exploitation hurt his wife and cost him his children, Peter still did not learn or change. His attempt to frame Cleveland showed he continued making terrible decisions, even when facing serious consequences. His failed courtroom performance showed he could not understand what behavior was appropriate even in high-stakes situations where his family was on the line. The return to normal at the end of the episode showed that Peter faced no lasting consequences for any of his actions. He injured his wife severely enough to hospitalize her. He lost custody of his children. He tried to frame an innocent man. He failed in court and was called a monster by a judge. None of this changed Peter's life permanently. Once Lois recovered and got the children back, everything reset to the status quo. Peter presumably continued having the same IQ of 70 and the same impaired judgment, but the family went back to functioning as though the custody crisis had never happened. The episode provided canonical confirmation that Peter Griffin's IQ placed him in the intellectually disabled range, and that this disability made him legally unfit to raise children without supervision. These facts became part of the established character history, even though later episodes rarely referenced the custody incident directly. Peter's low intelligence remained a consistent character trait, and the official IQ score of 70 gave a specific numerical measure to exactly how impaired Peter's cognitive function actually was compared to the general population. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the fact that Peter qualifies as a domestic terrorist after bombing a children's hospital. Peter Griffin committed an act of mass casualty violence that killed 19 children when he blew up part of a children's hospital while attempting corporate sabotage at his workplace. This incident occurred during Season 7, Episode 6 of Family Guy titled Tales of a Third Grade Nothing. The explosion resulted from Peter's attempt to impress his boss by destroying a competitor's property, but his incompetence turned the act of corporate vandalism into a deadly attack on a medical facility filled with sick and injured children. The chain of events began when Peter was sent upstairs at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery to deliver shipping reports to the CEO. This was a routine task that should have taken only a few minutes. Instead of completing his assignment, Peter decided to use the executive bathroom. This bathroom was reserved exclusively for company executives and was not meant for regular employees like Peter. Peter went into the executive bathroom anyway because he was curious about what made it special. When Peter entered the executive bathroom, he discovered it was extraordinarily lavish. The bathroom had luxurious furnishings and amenities far beyond what normal employees had access to. The executive bathroom was so impressive that it motivated Peter to completely change his approach to his job. Peter decided he wanted to become an executive specifically so he could use this bathroom regularly. The bathroom became Peter's primary motivation for career advancement rather than money, power, or professional achievement. Peter returned to work determined to impress his boss, Angela, so she would promote him to an executive position. Angela was Peter's superior at the brewery and had the authority to recommend employees for promotions. Peter knew that if he could demonstrate improved work performance and dedication to the company, Angela might consider him for the next available executive position. Peter began trying to show Angela that he was serious about doing well at work. Peter's attempts to impress Angela involved trying to help the company succeed against its competitors. The Pawtucket Patriot Brewery competed with other beer companies for market share and customers. One of their competitors was Anheuser-Busch, a major beer manufacturer with significantly more resources and brand recognition than the Pawtucket Brewery. Peter decided that destroying competitor property would demonstrate his loyalty and value to Angela and the company. Peter noticed that Anheuser-Busch had erected a billboard advertising their products. This billboard was visible from the brewery and served as a constant reminder of the competition. The billboard was located directly next to a children's hospital. The hospital treated sick and injured children and was actively operating with patients inside at the time Peter made his plan. The proximity of the billboard to the hospital should have been an obvious safety concern for anyone planning to destroy the billboard using explosives. Peter decided to blow up the Anheuser-Busch billboard to impress Angela. He obtained explosives through means not specified in the episode. Peter had access to enough explosive material to completely destroy a large billboard structure. He did not appear to have any training in handling explosives safely or experience in controlled demolitions. Peter acted as though blowing up the billboard was a simple task, rather than a dangerous operation requiring expertise and careful planning. Peter set up his explosive device to destroy the competitor's billboard. He invited Angela to watch the billboard destruction from a window at the brewery. Peter wanted Angela to witness him taking direct action against the competition. He believed this demonstration of aggressive business tactics would prove his executive material. Angela looked out the window as Peter prepared to trigger the explosion. Peter detonated the explosives. The explosion did not go as Peter planned. Instead of destroying only the billboard, the blast spread to the children's hospital that was located directly next to the target. The explosion blew up part of the children's hospital building. The force of the blast damaged the hospital structure enough to cause casualties inside. Sick children who were receiving medical treatment were killed by the explosion Peter triggered. The death toll from Peter's explosion was 19 children. These were pediatric patients who were in the hospital receiving care for their medical conditions. They died because Peter chose to use explosives near a functioning medical facility without considering the consequences. The children killed had no connection to Peter's workplace rivalry with Anheuser-Busch. They were innocent victims of Peter's reckless attempt to impress his boss through corporate vandalism. Angela witnessed the hospital explosion from the brewery window. She watched as Peter's attempt to destroy a billboard instead destroyed part of a children's hospital and killed 19 pediatric patients. The transcript indicates Angela said, "Oh my God, this is horrible," when she saw what Peter had done. She recognized immediately that something terrible had occurred. Despite witnessing this mass casualty incident, Angela's reaction to Peter was not what anyone would expect. Angela was impressed by Peter's initiative at work, despite the fact that he had just killed 19 children. She saw Peter's willingness to take extreme action against competitors as a positive trait. Angela appreciated that Peter was finally showing motivation and dedication to the company. The dead children did not immediately disqualify Peter from consideration for promotion in Angela's mind. She recommended Peter for an open executive spot at the brewery based on his recent improved performance. Angela's recommendation moved Peter forward in the promotion process. Peter believed he was about to achieve his goal of becoming an executive and gaining access to the executive bathroom. Then the Human Resources Department intervened. Human Resources reviewed Peter's employment file and discovered a significant problem that had nothing to do with the hospital explosion. The records showed that Peter had never completed the 3rd grade in elementary school. The brewery had educational requirements for executive positions. All executives needed to have at least completed elementary school. Peter's failure to finish 3rd grade decades earlier meant he did not meet the minimum educational qualifications for the executive job. Human Resources informed Angela that Peter could not be promoted until he went back to school and completed the 3rd grade. The hospital explosion was apparently not considered grounds for denying the promotion, but Peter's lack of a 3rd grade education was. Peter enrolled in elementary school as an adult student to complete the 3rd grade. He attended class with young children and behaved inappropriately throughout his time there. Peter did badly at school and showed little aptitude for learning or following classroom rules. Despite his poor academic performance, Peter was selected to participate in the school spelling bee. During the competition, Peter performed badly on most words. Then he was given the word lesbians to spell. Peter correctly spelled lesbians and won the spelling bee. This victory was enough for the school to pass Peter and award him a 3rd grade completion certificate. Peter returned to the Pawtucket, the Yuston Patriot Brewery with his 3rd grade diploma. He was ready to accept his promotion to executive and finally gain regular access to the luxurious executive bathroom. Peter approached Angela expecting congratulations and his new executive position. Instead, Angela delivered completely different news. She told Peter he was going to jail for the hospital explosion. Peter was shocked because Angela had previously seemed untroubled by the incident. Angela explained that Peter should not have expected the hospital explosion to be forgotten. There had been a full investigation into the incident. Law enforcement had collected fingerprints from the scene. Forensic experts had analyzed the evidence from the explosion site. All of this investigation had pointed directly to Peter as the person responsible for the bombing. The FBI had conducted the investigation and determined with certainty that Peter Griffin was guilty of blowing up part of the children's hospital and causing 19 deaths. The authorities arrested Peter and brought him to court. A judge presided over Peter's case. The evidence against Peter was overwhelming. His fingerprints were on the explosive materials. Forensic reports confirmed Peter had planted and detonated the device. The FBI had traced every aspect of the crime back to Peter. There were 19 dead children whose deaths resulted directly from Peter's actions. The judge found Peter guilty of the hospital bombing. The sentencing phase of Peter's trial arrived. Peter faced serious charges including multiple counts of murder, destruction of a medical facility, and terrorism. The deaths of 19 children through a bombing would normally result in an extremely severe sentence. Many jurisdictions would impose life in prison or even the death penalty for killing 19 children through a bombing attack. Peter's sentence would determine how many years he would spend in prison for his crimes. The judge sentenced Peter to 7 days in prison. This sentence was shockingly lenient given that Peter had killed 19 children by bombing a hospital. 7 days represented 1 week of incarceration for an act of mass murder. The judge specified that Peter would be released the following Sunday night at 9 o'clock. This time specification was a reference to Family Guy's regular broadcast time slot, but within the show's reality, it meant Peter would serve exactly 1 week in prison for killing 19 children. Peter served his 7-day sentence and was released on schedule. He returned home to his family and his life. There were no apparent long-term consequences for Peter beyond the single week in prison. He went back to living in Quahog, working at the brewery and spending time with his family. The 19 children he killed remained dead, but Peter faced no further punishment or restrictions after serving his minimal sentence. The episode established several disturbing facts about Peter and the legal system in the Family Guy universe. Peter killed 19 children through an act of violence he committed while trying to advance his career. The explosion was not an accident in the sense that Peter did not intend to use explosives. He deliberately planted and detonated a bomb. The fact that he hit the wrong target does not change that Peter chose to use explosive devices in a populated area without regard for safety. Peter showed no remorse for killing 19 children. When Angela told him he was going to jail, Peter seemed surprised and upset about facing consequences. But he never expressed sorrow for the dead children. Peter never apologized to the families of his victims. He never acknowledged that what he did was morally wrong beyond being legally problematic for his career. Peter's only concern was how the hospital explosion affected his promotion prospects and his freedom. Angela's initial reaction to the hospital explosion revealed troubling corporate values at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery. She witnessed Peter kill 19 children and her first response was to be impressed by his aggressive approach to business competition. Angela considered recommending Peter for promotion immediately after watching him blow up a children's hospital. Only the human resources technicality about his education stopped the promotion initially. Angela apparently believed that killing children while attempting corporate sabotage demonstrated desirable executive qualities. The criminal justice system's response to Peter's crime was absurdly inadequate. Peter received 7 days in prison for killing 19 children through a bombing attack. This sentence suggests that in the Family Guy universe, mass murder of children carries minimal consequences if the perpetrator is a working-class white man from Rhode Island. The FBI conducted a thorough investigation that conclusively proved Peter's guilt. Yet this overwhelming evidence and the severity of the crime resulted in only a week of incarceration. The episode treated the 19 dead children as background details rather than victims worthy of serious consideration. The show presented their deaths as a consequence of Peter's incompetence rather than a tragedy deserving emotional weight. The children were never named, their families were never shown. The hospital staff who witnessed the explosion were not depicted. The community response to having 19 children killed in a hospital bombing was not addressed. The deaths existed only as a legal problem for Peter to navigate, rather than as a human catastrophe. Peter's motive for the crime was entirely selfish and trivial. He killed 19 children because he wanted to use a fancy bathroom at work. Peter did not bomb the hospital out of political ideology, mental illness, or even serious business rivalry. He committed mass murder because he was trying to impress his boss, so she would promote him so he could access better bathroom facilities. The complete disproportion between Peter's motive and the consequences of his actions highlighted his profound lack of judgment and empathy. The method Peter used to kill the children demonstrated reckless disregard for human life. Peter obtained and deployed explosives in a populated area next to a functioning hospital. He did not attempt to verify that the hospital would be empty. He did not try to minimize collateral damage. He did not consider whether the explosive force would spread beyond his intended target. Peter detonated bombs near a children's hospital and seemed surprised when children in the hospital died as a result. Peter's lack of expertise in demolitions contributed to the catastrophic outcome. Peter had no apparent training in handling explosives or conducting controlled demolitions. A professional demolitions expert would have assessed the blast radius, considered structural concerns, and ensured no people were in danger before detonating explosives. Peter simply pointed explosives at a billboard and triggered them without any safety planning. His incompetence turned attempted vandalism into mass casualty violence. The investigation that followed Peter's attack confirmed it was not a mysterious or unsolved crime. Law enforcement quickly identified Peter as the perpetrator through physical evidence and forensic analysis. Peter's fingerprints were on the explosive materials. The FBI traced the bombing directly to Peter through standard investigative techniques. There was never any doubt about who committed the crime or whether it was intentional. Peter deliberately planted and detonated explosives. The fact that he hit the wrong target did not make the act accidental. The episode's treatment of the hospital bombing as comedy demonstrated the show's willingness to make jokes about child death and mass violence. The premise that Peter could kill 19 children, serve 1 week in prison, and return to normal life was presented as an absurd situation rather than a horrific crime. The show expected audiences to find humor in the extreme disproportionality between Peter's actions and their consequences. The dead children were the punchline rather than the tragedy. Peter Griffin bombed a children's hospital and killed 19 pediatric patients while attempting to vandalize a competitor's billboard to impress his boss and earn a promotion. He was investigated by the FBI, found guilty in court, and sentenced to 7 days in prison. After serving his 1-week sentence, Peter returned to his normal life without facing any additional consequences for committing mass murder of children through a terrorist bombing attack on a medical facility. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the fact that Peter's bigotry once led to wheelchair bans and even hate crime charges. Peter Griffin's bigotry and discrimination became matters of criminal justice when he banned disabled people from his restaurant and later shot an unarmed black teenager while playing neighborhood watchman. These two incidents from the episodes No Meals on Wheels and A Shot in the Dark revealed Peter's willingness to discriminate against people based on physical disability and his dangerous incompetence with firearms that resulted in hate crime charges. Both situations showed Peter treating marginalized groups with contempt and facing legal and social consequences for his actions. The restaurant discrimination began when Peter opened an establishment called Big Pete's House of Munch. Peter started this restaurant after finding a valuable coin worth $50,000. He used this money to open his own dining establishment. The restaurant struggled initially to attract customers. Peter needed help getting people through the door to make his business viable. He turned to his friend and neighbor Joe Swanson for assistance bringing in customers. Joe Swanson was a police officer who used a wheelchair due to a spinal injury that left him paralyzed from the waist down. Joe had many friends in the disabled community who also used wheelchairs for mobility. When Peter asked Joe to help bring customers to the restaurant, Joe invited his wheelchair-using friends to eat at Big Pete's House of Munch. These disabled patrons became regular customers who frequented the restaurant and spent money there. The restaurant became popular specifically among the disabled community. Peter was not happy with this customer base despite the fact that these disabled patrons were keeping his business afloat. Peter believed that having wheelchair users as his primary customers made his restaurant uncool. He wanted his establishment to be seen as a hip and trendy place. Peter convinced himself that the presence of disabled people prevented his restaurant from achieving the cool image he desired. The fact that these customers were paying for food and keeping his business running did not matter to Peter compared to his perception of coolness. Peter decided to ban wheelchair users from entering his restaurant. He created a no-handicapped customers policy for his establishment. This was not a policy based on legitimate business concerns or accessibility limitations. Peter explicitly stated he was banning disabled people because they were uncool. He was implementing discrimination based purely on his personal aesthetic preferences about what type of customers he wanted to be seen serving. When Joe arrived at the restaurant with his friends for their regular visit, Peter stopped them at the entrance. Joe asked if they could come in for dinner as usual. Peter told Joe no, they could not enter. Peter explained that the restaurant had a new policy. He informed Joe directly that he did not want Joe and his kind eating at the restaurant anymore. Peter used the phrase "your kind" when referring to disabled people, treating them as a category of people who should be excluded. Peter told Joe that the disabled customers were ruining what was supposed to be a cool establishment. Peter was accusing his disabled customers of destroying his restaurant's reputation simply by existing there as paying patrons. Joe, who was one of Peter's closest friends, asked Peter directly if he had a problem with Joe being handicapped. This was a reasonable question given that Peter had just announced he was banning all wheelchair users from his business. Peter answered yes. He confirmed that he had a problem with Joe being handicapped. Peter then made a shocking statement about disability. He told Joe that he thought being disabled was immoral. Peter declared that disability was a lifestyle choice that disabled people were forcing on America. These statements revealed that Peter believed disability was something people chose rather than a medical condition resulting from injury or illness. Peter was treating disability as though it were a moral failing or political position, rather than a physical reality. Joe and his disabled friends were understandably angry at being banned from a restaurant where they had been regular paying customers. They were being told they could not eat at an establishment simply because of their physical disabilities. This discrimination violated their basic rights as customers and human beings. The disabled community decided to take action against Peter's discriminatory policy. The wheelchair users united together and formed a giant robot called Crippletron. This robot was constructed from multiple wheelchairs combining together. The individual wheelchair users merged their mobility devices into a single large mechanical entity. Crippletron could walk despite being made from the wheelchairs of people who could not walk themselves. The robot also had offensive capabilities and could shoot parts of itself as missiles. Crippletron attacked Peter's restaurant. The giant robot began destroying the building, while Peter, his son Chris, and his infant son Stewie were on the roof. The assault continued until Peter's infant son Stewie took matters into his own hands. Stewie covered Joe's eyes to defeat Crippletron. This action caused the robot to malfunction and fall apart. Crippletron collapsed and fell directly onto Peter, crushing him under its weight. The falling robot broke one of Peter's legs. The injury was severe enough that Peter needed immediate medical attention. He was taken to the hospital for treatment. The doctors determined that Peter would need to use a wheelchair for 2 weeks while his broken leg healed. Peter was now temporarily disabled himself and would experience firsthand what it was like to rely on a wheelchair for mobility. Peter's time in the wheelchair apparently gave him some perspective on disability. After spending time navigating the world as a wheelchair user, Peter apologized to Joe. He admitted that he had judged Joe and his friends unfairly. He acknowledged that being disabled was tough and that he had been wrong to ban wheelchair users from his restaurant. Joe accepted Peter's apology, touched that Peter finally understood the difficulties of being disabled. The two friends reconciled after Peter gained empathy through experiencing temporary disability himself. The second major incident of bigotry and discrimination occurred several years later when Peter shot Cleveland Brown Jr., an unarmed black teenager. This shooting happened during Peter's participation in a neighborhood watch group. The situation began when Peter had his family couch outside on the front lawn. Peter and his friends Joe, Cleveland, and Quagmire were using the outdoor couch as a place to sit and drink together. Someone took the couch. though it was actually just mistaken for trash rather than stolen. The missing couch prompted Peter and his friends to form a neighborhood watch group. The stated purpose was to protect the neighborhood from crime and keep watch over people's property. Joe explained to the group that neighborhood watch members were not supposed to carry guns. Despite Joe's clear statement that guns were not allowed for neighborhood watch participants, Peter managed to obtain firearms for the group anyway. He acquired multiple guns and distributed them to use during their watch activities. Peter was on watch duty when he observed a shadowy figure attempting to enter Cleveland's house through a window. Peter did not approach to investigate who the person was or what they were doing. Peter did not call out to identify himself or warn the person. Peter did not call the police to report a suspected break-in. Instead, Peter immediately shot at the shadowy figure. The bullet hit the person in the arm, causing an injury that required medical treatment. The person Peter shot was Cleveland Brown Jr., the teenage son of Peter's friend, Cleveland. Cleveland Jr. was not a burglar or home invader. He was entering his own house through the window. Cleveland Jr. explained later that he used the window instead of the door because his father Cleveland had a rule about not opening the front door. Cleveland believed that opening the door released more air conditioning than opening a window, so he required family members to use the window to preserve climate control. Cleveland Jr. was also wearing headphones and listening to music, which was why he did not hear Peter approaching or calling out before Peter shot him. Peter went to the hospital to meet with the Brown family and apologize for shooting Cleveland Jr. The meeting did not go well. Cleveland and his wife Donna were furious with Peter. They accused Peter of being a racist. They stated that Peter shot Cleveland Jr. because of the color of his skin. Cleveland Jr. explained that he had not heard Peter approach because he was listening to music through his headphones. Despite this explanation of why the miscommunication occurred, Cleveland and Donna maintained that the shooting was motivated by racial prejudice. Joe attempted to defuse the situation by explaining that the police had investigated the shooting and deemed it an accident. Joe's professional assessment as a police officer was that Peter had made a terrible mistake but had not committed a crime. Cleveland rejected this explanation completely. Cleveland refused to accept that the shooting was accidental. He refused to have anything further to do with Peter. Cleveland ended his friendship with Peter on the spot. Cleveland went further than just ending his personal relationship with Peter. Cleveland went on television and gave an interview to news anchor Tom Tucker. During this televised interview, Cleveland publicly accused Peter of committing a hate crime. Cleveland told the media and the public that Peter's shooting of Cleveland Jr. was racially motivated violence rather than an accident. This television appearance transformed the incident from a private matter between friends into a public controversy about racial violence. The community of Quahog responded to Cleveland's television interview by turning against Peter. The town labeled Peter as a racist and began treating the Griffin family as pariahs. An angry crowd formed outside the Griffin house. Peter became a target of public hatred and accusations of bigotry. The situation escalated from a tragic accident into a major social crisis with Peter at the center. Peter decided he needed to prove to everyone that he was not racist. He attempted to make peace with Cleveland by bringing him a bottle of alcohol and cigars as gifts. Peter's attempt at reconciliation went disastrously wrong. During the visit, one of the lit cigars fell into the bottle of alcohol and ignited the liquid. Small fires broke out on Cleveland's lawn. Peter tried to extinguish the flames, but his actions made the fire worse. He grabbed a cloth from Cleveland's pocket and stuffed it into the bottle, thinking this would stop the fire. Instead, this created a larger flame. The bottle became too hot to hold, and Peter threw it away from himself. The burning bottle landed inside Cleveland's house and set the building on fire. A crowd had gathered outside Cleveland's home by this point to watch the confrontation between Peter and Cleveland. The crowd witnessed Peter's actions that led to Cleveland's house catching fire. Peter began shouting at Cleveland to get his family out of the burning house. To the crowd watching, Peter's shouting appeared threatening rather than helpful. The people gathered outside did not understand that Peter was trying to warn Cleveland about the fire. They interpreted Peter's yelling as aggressive behavior and further evidence of racist intent. The crowd included white supremacists who were excited by what they thought Peter was doing. These skinhead extremists believed Peter was deliberately burning down a black family's home as an act of racial terrorism. Their presence and support made Peter look even worse to observers. The community saw Peter apparently committing arson against a black family, while racist extremists cheered him on. Joe arrived at the scene with other police officers. Joe was forced by his police supervisors to arrest Peter. The arrest was not based on evidence that Peter had committed a crime. Joe and his fellow officers knew the house fire was an accident. They arrested Peter specifically to pacify the black community of Quahog. The police department made a political decision to arrest Peter in response to public pressure rather than based on evidence of criminal intent. Joe arrested Peter and charged him with attempted murder of Cleveland Jr. and hate crimes. Peter was taken to jail and held in custody. While Peter was incarcerated, his father-in-law, Carter Pewterschmidt, came to visit him. Carter offered to help bail Peter out of jail. Carter also said he would provide a distraction for the community. Carter had the resources and connections to mount a legal defense for Peter. Peter's case went to court. Cleveland Jr. testified about being shot by Peter. The teenager's testimony was emotional and moved the courtroom to tears. Then Carter's lawyer began cross-examining Cleveland Jr. The lawyer's strategy was to attack Cleveland Jr.'s character and make him appear dangerous. The lawyer questioned Cleveland Jr. about his music preferences, particularly noting that he listened to rap music. The lawyer used Cleveland Jr.'s music choice to imply that he was a thug or criminal. The lawyer then placed a knife on the witness stand and asked Cleveland Jr. to pick it up. When Cleveland Jr. picked up the knife as instructed, the lawyer acted threatened and claimed Cleveland Jr. was dangerous. The lawyer successfully made Cleveland Jr. appear aggressive to the courtroom, despite the fact that the teenager had done nothing but follow the lawyer's own instructions. The lawyer even got Cleveland Jr. briefly arrested based on this manufactured threat. Peter objected to what his lawyer was doing. Peter stopped the character assassination of Cleveland Jr. and spoke out against the racist tactics being used in his defense. Peter recognized that his lawyer was using racial stereotypes about black teenagers to make Cleveland Jr. look like a criminal. Peter refused to let his defense continue along these lines, even though it was helping his case. This was the first time Peter showed genuine moral clarity about the situation. Cleveland confronted Peter outside the courtroom after the hearing. Cleveland told Peter that their friendship was over permanently. The mob outside Cleveland's house had now turned against the Brown family. The crowd that had previously supported Cleveland and condemned Peter was now threatening Cleveland and his family. The public opinion had shifted based on the courtroom testimony that portrayed Cleveland Jr. as potentially dangerous. Peter interceded to stop the mob from attacking Cleveland and his family. Peter stood up publicly and admitted to shooting Cleveland Jr. Peter stated clearly that he had shot the teenager and should be held accountable for his actions. Peter explained that he shot Cleveland Jr. because he was scared and did something stupid, not because of the color of Cleveland Jr.'s skin. This was Peter finally taking full responsibility for what he had done without making excuses. Cleveland was touched by Peter finally admitting the truth and taking responsibility. In response, Cleveland made a false statement to protect Peter from the mob. Cleveland claimed that he himself had shot Cleveland Jr. This claim caused the crowd to immediately lose interest. The mob fled because they did not care about black-on-black crime the way they had cared about what they thought was white-on-black violence. This revealed the racism within the mob itself. Cleveland admitted to Peter that he realized the shooting happened because of Peter's stupidity rather than racism. Cleveland forgave Peter for shooting his son. The two friends reconciled after Peter took responsibility and Cleveland recognized that racial hatred was not Peter's motive. Peter apologized directly to Cleveland Jr. for shooting him. Cleveland Jr. appeared to accept the apology, though after Cleveland left, the teenager made an ambiguous threat toward Peter before skipping away cheerfully, leaving Peter uncertain whether Cleveland Jr. was joking or serious about future retaliation. These two incidents demonstrated different aspects of Peter's bigotry and the consequences he faced. In the restaurant situation, Peter engaged in deliberate discrimination against disabled people based on his prejudiced belief that disability made people uncool and was somehow a choice. He banned paying customers from his business purely because of their physical disabilities. He called disability immoral and treated it as a lifestyle choice. This was clear, intentional discrimination that violated the rights of disabled people. Peter only changed his views after temporarily experiencing disability himself through injury. In the shooting incident, Peter's actions were not motivated by conscious racial hatred, but his behavior demonstrated dangerous negligence and inability to recognize how his actions would be perceived. Peter obtained guns when he was told not to have them. Peter shot first without identifying his target or assessing the situation. Peter's subsequent attempts to make amends showed such poor judgment that he accidentally committed what appeared to be arson against a black family's home. While Peter's intent was not racist, his actions caused serious harm to a black teenager and reinforced racial trauma through his incompetence. The legal system responded very differently to these two incidents. Peter faced no criminal charges for discriminating against disabled people at his restaurant. The only consequence was the destruction of his restaurant by the disabled community taking revenge through the Crippletron attack. The law did not punish Peter for violating the civil rights of disabled customers. In contrast, Peter faced arrest and hate crime charges for shooting Cleveland Jr. even though the police determined it was an accident. The criminal charges came not from evidence of racial animus, but from political pressure on the police department. Peter was prosecuted to satisfy public demands for accountability rather than based on proof of criminal intent. The case ultimately collapsed when Peter admitted responsibility and Cleveland forgave him, but Peter faced incarceration and serious legal jeopardy despite lacking racist motivation. Peter Griffin's bigotry took different forms across these incidents. His discrimination against disabled people was conscious, deliberate, and based on explicit prejudice beliefs about disability being uncool and immoral. His shooting of Cleveland Jr. resulted from stupidity and recklessness rather than racial hatred, but still caused serious harm to a black teenager and trauma to the black community. Both situations revealed Peter's failure to treat marginalized people with basic respect, and his pattern of causing harm through prejudice, incompetence, or both. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Next up, we have the fact of Peter's addictive drinking and the many times he's been treated as a full-blown alcoholic. Peter Griffin's relationship with alcohol has always been a defining characteristic of his life, but the episode Friends of Peter G from Season 9 explicitly confronted Peter as a genuine alcoholic requiring intervention. After causing a drunken disturbance at a movie theater, Peter and his dog Brian were court-ordered to attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings for 30 days. This legal mandate framed Peter's drinking not as comedic excess but as a serious problem requiring professional treatment. When Peter continued drinking and driving despite the intervention, he crashed his car and died. Death himself appeared to show Peter two possible futures, one where continued heavy drinking turned him into an abusive monster who tortured his family, and another where complete sobriety made him an uptight bore. This supernatural intervention forced Peter to confront his alcoholism directly. Peter and Brian went to the Quahog Cinema to watch a double feature that included the live-action film The Sound of Music. They brought alcohol into the theater and consumed it throughout the screening. Peter became heavily intoxicated during the movie. His drinking reached levels that impaired his judgment and behavior to the point where he could not control himself in public. Peter began disrupting the theater during the film. He talked loudly throughout the screening, bothering other patrons who had paid to watch the movie in peace. Other audience members repeatedly asked Peter to be quiet and stop disturbing them. Peter refused to comply with these reasonable requests from fellow moviegoers. His disruption continued and escalated. Brian was also drunk and participated in the disturbance alongside Peter. The two of them created such a significant disruption that other patrons complained to theater management. The situation reached a point where the intoxicated behavior could not be ignored or tolerated. Peter began shouting at the movie screen itself, complaining about the figures on screen talking through the film. This made no logical sense, as the actors on screen were the actual movie Peter had paid to see. Peter and Brian then physically attacked the movie screen. They rushed toward the screen and began assaulting it, while other patrons watched in shock and horror. This destruction of theater property crossed the line from mere disruption into criminal damage and threatening behavior. The attack on the screen frightened other audience members and created a dangerous situation in the crowded theater. Theater management called the police to respond to the violent disturbance. Officer Joe Swanson arrived at the scene. Joe found Peter and Brian still intoxicated and responsible for the chaos in the theater. Joe arrested both Peter and Brian for their drunken disruption and property damage. The two were taken into custody and charged with crimes related to their alcohol-fueled behavior. Joe Swanson received a noise complaint about the community center. As a police officer, Joe responded to investigate the disturbance. Peter and the other attendees realized they were about to be caught drinking at an AA meeting. They needed to hide their alcohol consumption from Joe or face serious consequences for violating their court-ordered treatment. Peter organized an elaborate deception to fool Joe. The group quickly transformed the community center to look like a church rather than an AA meeting space. They staged an elaborate musical performance of the song Mr. Booze from the 1964 film Robin and the Seven Hoods. The song was originally about the dangers of alcohol, making it perfect cover for their charade. Peter led the entire group in this extended musical number. The performance went on for an extremely long time, consuming nearly a third of the episode's running time. The song featured elaborate choreography, jazz instrumentation, and theatrical staging. The recovering alcoholics sang and danced about the evils of alcohol while secretly remaining drunk from the beer Peter had brought. Joe arrived during this musical performance. He heard the group singing a religious-sounding song about resisting temptation and avoiding alcohol. The elaborate staging convinced Joe that he had responded to a church gathering rather than an AA meeting. Joe apologized for the intrusion and left without investigating further. The deception worked perfectly. Peter and the recovering alcoholic successfully hid their drinking from law enforcement. After the meeting ended, Peter decided to drive home. Peter was heavily intoxicated from all the beer he had consumed during the AA meeting. Peter got behind the wheel of his car despite being far too drunk to drive safely. This was an extremely dangerous decision that put Peter's life and the lives of everyone else on the road at serious risk. Peter drove down the street while drunk. He fell asleep at the wheel while driving. Peter lost control of his vehicle and crashed directly into a tree. The impact was severe and violent. The crash killed Peter instantly. Peter died from injuries sustained in the drunk driving accident that he caused by choosing to operate a vehicle while intoxicated. Death arrived at the scene of the crash. Death was voiced by Adam Carolla and appeared as a recurring character who collected souls when people died. Peter's soul exited his body after the fatal crash. Peter's ghost stood next to Death, looking at his own dead body trapped in the wrecked car. Peter was so intoxicated at the time of his death that even his ghost remained drunk, with his soul exhibiting signs of impairment. Death decided to give Peter a second chance rather than taking him permanently. However, Death told Peter there were some things they needed to do first. Death explained that Peter needed to understand alcohol better before he could return to life. Death was going to show Peter where his life was headed if he continued drinking as heavily as he currently did. Death transported Peter into a possible future timeline. This was a vision of what Peter's life would become if he continued his pattern of excessive drinking without change. Death and Peter arrived at the Griffin family home to observe what future Peter would be like as a severe alcoholic who never stopped drinking. Future Peter appeared as a drunken, filthy, abusive man. He was slurring his words and could barely stand. His appearance was disheveled and disgusting. Future Peter called his family together and ordered them to line up. He announced it was time for cigar burns. This was apparently a daily ritual where Future Peter tortured his family members. Future Peter took a lit cigar and deliberately burned each member of his family with it. Lois screamed in pain as the hot cigar touched her skin. Chris and Meg cried out in agony as their father burned them. This was systematic physical abuse that Peter inflicted on his wife and children every single day. The torture had become so routine that Future Peter announced it casually, as though burning his family was a normal household activity. A child Peter and present Peter did not recognize appeared in the lineup. This child introduced himself as Macabre, speaking with a British accent. Macabre explained he was Peter's other son and was there to receive his cigar burn. This suggested that Future Peter had fathered additional children beyond Chris, Meg, and Stewie. Macabre calmly accepted being burned by his father as though this abuse was normal. Stewie was the only family member who appeared to enjoy the cigar burns. The infant laughed and seemed pleased by the torture. This was consistent with Stewie's character as a sadistic baby who enjoyed violence and pain. However, everyone else in the family clearly suffered from Future Peter's daily abuse. Future Peter then dismissed Stewie from the house using cruel language. He called Stewie stupid laugh and cry and other insulting names. Future Peter showed no affection toward any of his children and treated them with complete contempt. The abuse went beyond physical torture to include constant verbal degradation and emotional cruelty. Death then transported present Peter to another location. They arrived at the bathroom at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery where Peter worked. Death showed Peter what was happening inside one of the bathroom stalls. Future Peter was inside the stall having sex with his boss, Angela. Angela was a character voiced by Carrie Fisher who served as Peter's supervisor at work. Present Peter found Angela physically repulsive and would never normally consider having sexual relations with her. Future Peter was moaning with pleasure and telling Angela how good the sex felt. Angela mentioned that dunking Peter's hand in the toilet had been a good idea, suggesting their sexual encounter involved degrading acts in the filthy bathroom. Present Peter was horrified by what he witnessed. He declared that he would never have sex with Angela because she was disgusting. Death explained that Future Peter would have sex with Angela when he was drunk enough. Alcohol removed Peter's inhibitions and judgment to the point where he would engage in sexual acts with someone he found revolting while sober. Future Peter was having an affair with his boss in a workplace bathroom, which demonstrated how far his alcoholism would cause his life to deteriorate. Present Peter told Death that he understood the message. Seeing himself as an abusive drunk who tortured his family and had degrading sexual encounters had frightened Peter. He declared that he wished he had never touched a single drop of alcohol in his entire life. If drinking led to becoming the monster he just witnessed, Peter wanted to have lived a completely sober existence instead. Death responded that he would show Peter that alternative timeline as well. Death transported Peter to a version of his life where he had never consumed any alcohol at all. This was meant to show Peter what his life would look like as a person who practiced total abstinence from drinking throughout his entire life. Sober Peter appeared as an extremely cheerful and upbeat person. He spoke with a different voice that was higher pitched and more enthusiastic. Sober Peter gathered his family together and announced it was time for a Triple H. A hug, a handshake, or a high five. Each family member could choose which form of affection they wanted. Sober Peter was giving his family members choices about physical contact rather than forcing torture on them. Lois chose a hug. Sober Peter enthusiastically embraced his wife with genuine affection. Stewie also chose a hug, and Sober Peter happily hugged his infant son. The family seemed confused by this sudden display of healthy affection, but accepted it. Chris changed his mind multiple times between high fives and hugs, and Sober Peter accommodated each change with patience and kindness. Sober Peter then visited the Drunken Clam, which remained the local bar despite his sobriety. Instead of drinking beer with Joe and Quagmire as regular Peter did, Sober Peter sat with completely different friends. These new companions were uptight, dignified people who drank milk instead of alcohol. They had formal conversations and proper manners rather than the rowdy behavior of Peter's usual drinking buddies. Joe and Quagmire were still at the Drunken Clam, drinking beer as they normally did. Sober Peter looked at them with disdain and disapproval. He viewed Joe and Quagmire as noisy and uncouth troublemakers rather than friends. Sober Peter did not know Joe or Quagmire well because he had never bonded with them over drinking. His social circle consisted entirely of boring, pretentious people who looked down on anyone who enjoyed alcohol. Sober Peter also appeared similar to Captain Georg von Trapp from The Sound of Music. He marched his family around in rigid formation and maintained strict authoritarian control over the household. Everything about Sober Peter's life was stifling, uptight, and devoid of fun. He had become a completely different person, morally superior but insufferably boring. Present Peter did not like this version of himself either. The sober version was too strict, too judgmental, and too boring. Peter did not want to become that kind of person any more than he wanted to become the abusive drunk he had seen in the first vision. Both extreme versions of his life were unacceptable to Peter. He wanted something between the two extremes. Death explained the real lesson Peter needed to learn. Death told Peter that he did not need to give up alcohol altogether. The goal was not total abstinence or complete sobriety. Death said that Peter had the willpower to put the bottle down sometimes. Death argued that human beings had accomplished incredible things like sending a man to the moon and making Justin Long a movie star. If humanity could achieve those difficult goals, Peter could learn to drink in moderation rather than excess. Peter made a joke about Justin Long, acknowledging that America kept trying to make Justin Long a star even though audiences repeatedly rejected him. This humor suggested Peter was accepting Death's message. Death persuaded Peter that moderate drinking was possible and preferable to either extreme. Peter could continue enjoying alcohol as part of his life without letting it dominate and destroy everything. Death sent Peter back to his body. Peter woke up after his near-death experience with a new understanding of alcohol's role in his life. He returned home to his family and explained what he had learned from Death. Peter decided he would practice moderation in his drinking going forward. Peter's approach to moderation was characteristically crude but showed genuine effort. He went to the store and bought a six-pack of beer. When he got home, Peter opened the six-pack and threw 3 cans directly into the garbage. He kept the other 3 cans for himself. This was Peter's interpretation of drinking in moderation, consuming half the beer he would normally drink and discarding the rest. Lois was pleased to see Peter attempting to cut back on his alcohol consumption. The family accepted Peter's new approach to drinking. Peter had learned that he could continue drinking without becoming either an abusive monster or a boring teetotaler. The key was controlling his consumption and avoiding the excess that led to drunk driving, violence, and degradation. The episode ended with 2 seagulls at the garbage dump, discovering all the beer cans Peter had thrown away. The seagulls drank the discarded beer and became drunk themselves. One seagull ate something it thought was delicious food from a bucket labeled KFC. The other seagull informed him that he was actually eating another bird. The drunk seagull had a horrified reaction upon learning he had engaged in cannibalism while intoxicated. This dark joke reinforced the episode's message about how alcohol impairs judgment and causes people to do things they would never do sober. The episode Friends of Peter G explicitly treated Peter as a genuine alcoholic rather than just a funny drunk character. The court-mandated AA attendance recognized Peter's drinking as a legal problem requiring intervention. The judge determined that Peter could not control his drinking and needed professional treatment through a 12-step program. This was a formal diagnosis by the legal system that Peter suffered from alcohol addiction. Peter's behavior at the AA meetings demonstrated classic symptoms of alcoholism and denial. He refused to acknowledge he had a problem, despite clear evidence of his inability to control his drinking. Peter mocked other recovering alcoholics, rather than showing empathy for their struggles. He actively sabotaged the recovery of others by bringing alcohol to meetings and pressuring sober alcoholics to drink again. These actions showed Peter's complete lack of understanding about the severity of addiction. Peter's decision to drive drunk after an AA meeting showed that the court-ordered treatment was not working. Peter left a meeting specifically designed to help people stop drinking, got behind the wheel while intoxicated, and crashed his car. This demonstrated that Peter had learned nothing from the intervention and continued his dangerous drinking pattern despite legal consequences. Death's supernatural intervention accomplished what the legal system and AA meetings could not. Only dying and witnessing his possible futures did Peter accept that his drinking needed to change. The vision of himself as an abusive alcoholic who tortured his family showed Peter the worst-case outcome of continued excessive drinking. The contrasting vision of total sobriety showed Peter that complete abstinence would eliminate the parts of his personality he valued. The episode's message was that Peter was an alcoholic who needed to moderate his drinking rather than quit entirely. This was a somewhat controversial conclusion for an episode about alcoholism. Traditional AA philosophy emphasizes that alcoholics cannot drink moderately and must practice complete abstinence to maintain recovery. Death's advice that Peter could learn to put the bottle down sometimes contradicted the core principles of the 12-step program Peter had been court-ordered to attend. Peter's solution of throwing away half his beer demonstrated his interpretation of moderation. This crude approach showed Peter was making an effort to change his behavior, even if his method was simplistic. The episode suggested that Peter could continue drinking as long as he avoided the extremes that led to abuse, infidelity, and drunk driving crashes. The characterization of Peter as a genuine alcoholic remained part of the show's canon after this episode. Peter continued drinking throughout the series, but this episode established that his drinking was not harmless fun. The court recognized Peter as having a serious drinking problem. Death confirmed that Peter's current drinking pattern would lead to abuse and degradation. These were explicit acknowledgments that Peter suffered from alcoholism, rather than just enjoying beer with his friends. The episode framed alcoholism as a spectrum with multiple possible outcomes rather than a single path. Peter could become an abusive monster, a boring teetotaler, or something in between. The supernatural intervention by Death gave Peter knowledge of these futures and the opportunity to choose a different path. Whether Peter successfully maintained moderation or returned to his old drinking patterns was left ambiguous. But the episode clearly established Peter Griffin as an alcoholic who had been formally diagnosed and treated by both the legal system and Death himself. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the generational alcoholism passed down from Peter's real father, Mickey McFinnigan. Peter Griffin's alcoholism was revealed to be a genetic inheritance passed down from his biological father, Mickey McFinnigan, the town drunk of an Irish village. This revelation came in the episode Peter's Two Dads from Season 5, which began with Peter accidentally killing his stepfather, Francis Griffin, while performing drunk at his daughter Meg's 17th birthday party. Francis died in the hospital with his final words, condemning Peter as a fat, stinking drunk. Peter later discovered through hypnotherapy that Francis was not his biological father. Peter traveled to Ireland and found Mickey McFinnigan, who refused to believe Peter was his son until Peter beat him in a drinking contest. Mickey accepted Peter as family only after witnessing Peter's superior alcohol tolerance, declaring that nobody but a McFinnigan could handle that much drinking. The episode established that Peter's alcoholism was not merely a character flaw, but an inherited genetic trait from a father who was legendary for his drinking abilities. Meg Griffin's 17th birthday party was the setting for the tragedy that killed Francis Griffin. Peter and Lois had completely forgotten about Meg's birthday until their son Chris reminded them. When they finally remembered, Peter and Lois could not recall how old Meg was turning. They admitted they were unsure whether she was turning 16 or 17. This demonstrated the profound neglect Peter and Lois showed toward their daughter, not knowing basic facts about her age or birthday. Peter and Lois hastily organized a birthday party for Meg. The party they planned was completely inappropriate for a 17-year-old teenager. They treated Meg like a small child rather than someone nearly old enough to be an adult. The party featured childish games like pin the tail on the donkey. Meg was humiliated by how juvenile the party was. She complained that her parents had given her a party suited for a much younger child. Peter and Lois showed no understanding of what kind of party would be appropriate for their teenage daughter. Peter decided to perform entertainment at Meg's party by dressing up as a character he created called Pee Pants, the inebriated hobo clown. This costume and character name explicitly referenced drunkenness and homelessness. Peter wore dirty, ragged clothing to portray a homeless person who was intoxicated. The choice to dress as a drunk vagrant for his daughter's birthday party showed Peter's complete lack of judgment about appropriate behavior. Peter's performance as the drunken hobo clown went disastrously wrong from the start. Peter attempted a magic trick where he pulled scarves out of his mouth. Peter had tied multiple scarves together and swallowed them beforehand. Lois had explicitly told Peter not to swallow the scarves, but Peter did it anyway. When Peter pulled the long chain of scarves from his mouth, the act made him gag and vomit. Peter regurgitated the scarves covered in vomit and handed the disgusting mess to Meg as her birthday present. Meg was revolted by receiving vomit-soaked scarves from her father. Peter then pulled his long underwear from his stomach and regurgitated that as well. He crouched over in pain after vomiting up the clothing he had swallowed. The performance was grotesque and inappropriate for any birthday party, let alone one for his teenage daughter. Peter had ruined Meg's party with his Meg's party. Disgusting behavior, but he was not finished causing damage. Peter announced he would perform his grand unicycle finale. He got heavily drunk during the party. Peter's intoxication reached dangerous levels that severely impaired his coordination and judgment. Despite being far too drunk to safely operate any kind of vehicle, Peter decided to ride a unicycle down the staircase in the Griffin home. This was an extremely dangerous stunt, even for a sober person with excellent balance and unicycle skills. Peter climbed onto the unicycle at the top of the stairs. He attempted to ride down the staircase while drunk. Peter immediately lost control of the unicycle. His intoxication made it impossible for him to maintain balance or control his movements. Peter fell off the unicycle as he went down the stairs. He tumbled over the banister and fell through the air. Francis Griffin was standing at the bottom of the staircase. Peter's falling body crashed directly onto Francis with tremendous force. Peter's full body weight came down on top of Francis, crushing him violently. The impact of Peter's body landing on Francis caused catastrophic injuries. The force crushed Francis's ribs, breaking multiple bones in his chest. The impact ruptured Francis's spleen, causing massive internal bleeding. The trauma punctured Francis's lung, making it impossible for him to breathe properly. Francis was rushed to the hospital for emergency treatment. The injuries Peter had caused were too severe for Francis to survive. Francis lay dying in a hospital bed surrounded by his family. Peter stood at his stepfather's bedside, devastated by what he had done. Peter apologized profusely to Francis. Peter said he was so sorry for breaking all of Francis's ribs, busting his spleen and puncturing his lung. Peter told Francis he hoped Francis could hear him. Peter said he loved his father. Francis briefly regained consciousness in his final moments. Francis asked Peter to come closer. Peter leaned in to hear what Francis wanted to say. Peter thought Francis might offer forgiveness or express love for Peter in his dying breath. Instead, Francis used his last words to condemn Peter. Francis told Peter he was a fat, stinking drunk. These were Francis's final words before he died. Francis spent his last moment of life insulting Peter and blaming alcohol for destroying Peter's life. Peter was devastated by Francis's cruel final words. Peter had accidentally killed his father through drunken negligence, and Francis died without offering any forgiveness or love. Peter felt that Francis did not care about him at all. The last thing Peter's father ever said to him was an insult about his drinking problem. This rejection in Francis's dying moment traumatized Peter deeply. Lois and Brian discussed Francis's death on the front lawn of the Griffin house, standing behind Peter's back where he could not hear them. Both Lois and Brian were overjoyed that Francis was dead. They expressed happiness that Francis was finally gone. Neither showed any sadness or sympathy about Francis's death. They viewed his death as a relief rather than a tragedy. This revealed that Francis had been deeply disliked by Peter's wife and best friend. Peter became consumed with grief and guilt over killing Francis. Peter blamed alcohol for causing him to fall and crush his father. Peter declared that alcohol had ruined his life and caused this tragedy. Peter vowed that he would never drink again. Peter swore off alcohol completely in response to Francis's death and final condemnation. The scene immediately cut to Peter smoking crack cocaine. Peter had abandoned alcohol, but instead of becoming sober, he had switched to an even more dangerous and addictive drug. Peter sat in his home smoking crack from a pipe. When Brian discovered Peter smoking crack, Brian was horrified. Brian exclaimed what the fuck when he saw Peter using crack cocaine. Brian pointed out that crack was not a good substitute for alcohol. Peter had traded one addiction for another more harmful one. Peter became completely intoxicated on crack cocaine. His speech became slurred and incomprehensible. Peter babbled incoherently about the government coming to take his baby. The crack addiction was rapidly destroying Peter just as alcohol had. Brian realized Peter needed professional help to deal with both the trauma of killing Francis and his substance abuse problems. Brian referred Peter to a hypnotherapist. The hypnotherapist was a man named Bruce who helped people recover repressed memories. Bruce put Peter under hypnosis and told him to go back in his mind to his childhood and access his deepest memories. Peter began having flashbacks to events from his youth that he had buried in his subconscious. Peter remembered a specific incident from his childhood. Young Peter had made a Father's Day card for Francis. Peter approached Francis, who was sitting at the table reading his Bible. Peter held up the Father's Day card and wished Francis a happy Father's Day. Francis angrily responded that he was not Peter's father. Young Peter looked shocked and devastated by this revelation. This memory had been so traumatic that Peter had repressed it completely until the hypnotherapy session. Peter woke from the hypnosis session with a shocking realization. Francis Griffin was not Peter's biological father. This explained why Francis had been so cold and cruel to Peter throughout his life. Francis had raised Peter knowing that Peter was not his son. Peter wondered what other memories he had repressed from his childhood. Peter confronted his mother, Thelma Griffin, and demanded the truth. Thelma admitted that she had engaged in an extramarital affair. 40 years earlier, Thelma had taken a vacation to Ireland without her husband, Francis. While in Ireland, Thelma met an Irish man and had a sexual relationship with him. This affair resulted in Thelma becoming pregnant with Peter. Thelma returned to America and raised Peter as though he were Francis's son, never telling anyone the truth about Peter's biological father. Thelma revealed that Peter's real father was named Mickey McFinnigan. Mickey still lived in Ireland in a small village. Thelma provided enough information for Peter to locate Mickey. Peter decided he needed to travel to Ireland and meet his biological father. Peter wanted to understand where he came from and form a relationship with his real father. Brian agreed to accompany Peter on the trip to Ireland. Peter and Brian flew to Ireland and landed at the airport. The airplane runway was completely covered in empty beer bottles. Thousands of bottles littered the tarmac. This visual immediately confirmed the stereotype that Ireland had severe problems with alcohol consumption. The airport runway served as physical evidence of excessive drinking throughout the country. Peter and Brian traveled to Mickey McFinnigan's village. The village was called McSwiggan Village and was extremely small and rural. The village was filled with stereotypical Irish imagery and culture. Peter asked local villagers if they knew Mickey McFinnigan. The villagers immediately recognized the name. They explained that Mickey McFinnigan was the town drunk. Peter was initially horrified to learn that his biological father was the town drunk. Peter associated being called the town drunk with shame and social failure. However, the Irish villagers explained that in their community, being the town drunk was actually an honorable position. The title of town drunk was a distinction bestowed by the locals, rather than a mark of shame. The townspeople treated being the town drunk as an achievement that commanded respect. This cultural difference meant that Mickey McFinnigan held a prestigious role in his community, specifically because of his excessive drinking. Peter and Brian found Mickey McFinnigan at a tavern called Wifey McBeaty's. Mickey was exactly what Peter had been told, a legendary drunk who spent his time in the pub. Mickey looked remarkably similar to Peter. They shared the same body type, facial features, and general appearance. The physical resemblance made it obvious they were related. Peter introduced himself to Mickey and explained that he believed Mickey was his biological father. Peter told Mickey about Thelma Griffin and the affair they had 40 years earlier. Mickey refused to believe Peter's story. Mickey dismissed Peter's claims and made fun of him. Mickey did not think Peter was actually his son. Mickey demanded proof before he would accept that Peter was his child. Peter needed a way to prove to Mickey that they were truly father and son. Peter noticed that Francis's ghost had appeared to him along with the ghosts of Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi from Star Wars. All three ghosts called Peter a fat, stinking drunk. These were the same words Francis had used in his dying breath. The ghost of actor Hayden Christensen also appeared and announced his presence. Peter realized that Francis's dying words contained the key to proving his identity to Mickey. Francis had condemned Peter as a fat, stinking drunk. Mickey McFinnigan was the town drunk. Peter was also a notorious heavy drinker who had just been called a drunk by his dying father. The common thread among all three men was excessive alcohol consumption. Peter understood that he could prove he was Mickey's son by demonstrating his inherited ability to drink massive quantities of alcohol. Peter challenged Mickey McFinnigan to a drinking contest. Mickey accepted the challenge. The two men sat down at the bar and began consuming alcohol in large quantities. They drank beer after beer in rapid succession. The contest went on for an extended period with both men consuming dangerous amounts of alcohol. During the drinking contest, Peter and Mickey engaged in drunken conversation. They discussed American looks and diet, speaking in the slurred and incomprehensible manner of severely intoxicated people. Their speech became so impaired that they could barely form coherent sentences. Both men continued drinking, despite reaching levels of intoxication that would incapacitate most people. Peter won the drinking contest. He managed to consume more alcohol than Mickey without passing out or becoming too sick to continue. This was a remarkable achievement given that Mickey was legendary for his drinking abilities. Mickey had never been beaten in a drinking contest before. No one had ever matched his capacity for alcohol consumption. Mickey was shocked that Peter had defeated him. Mickey declared that nobody had ever beaten him at the game of drinking. The fact that Peter had won the contest proved something important to Mickey. Mickey stated that nobody but a McFinnigan could handle that much alcohol. The ability to drink such massive quantities was a genetic trait that ran in Mickey's family. Only someone with McFinnigan blood could possess such extraordinary alcohol tolerance. Mickey accepted Peter as his biological son based solely on Peter's drinking performance. The drinking contest served as a paternity test in Mickey's eyes. Mickey believed that Peter's superior alcohol tolerance proved they shared DNA. Mickey welcomed Peter into the McFinnigan family, specifically because Peter had inherited Mickey's drinking abilities. Peter had demonstrated that he was the broth of Mickey's own stubby shillelagh, meaning he was truly Mickey's offspring. Peter was excited to have formed a bond with his real father. Peter had found acceptance and approval from Mickey that he never received from Francis. Mickey celebrated Peter as his son. The townspeople gathered at the pub to witness the reunion. Peter, Mickey, and the entire bar full of Irish villagers began singing and dancing to a song called My Drunken Irish Dad. The musical number celebrated Peter's relationship with his alcoholic father and the shared drinking abilities that proved their connection. The lyrics to the song explicitly celebrated drunkenness and alcohol abuse. Peter sang about his drunken Irish dad and their bond through drinking. The musical performance treated excessive drinking as something positive and worth celebrating. The entire community joined in singing about alcoholism as though it were an achievement rather than a disease. During the final moments of the song, Mickey made a comment about how the Irish do not tan well. This was a random observation about Irish people's pale complexions and vulnerability to sunburn. Mickey then collapsed suddenly. Mickey had consumed what the bartender called a magoonie, which was slang for poisoned beer. Mickey had been given a poisoned drink and died immediately from it. Peter was devastated that his father had died right after they reunited. Peter now had two dead fathers. He wondered who would have poisoned Mickey's beer. Francis's ghost appeared and revealed that he had poisoned the beer. Francis admitted he was not kidding when he said question mark earlier, calling Peter a fat, stinking drunk one more time. Francis had murdered Mickey McFinnigan from beyond the grave to prevent Peter from having a relationship with his biological father. Brian pointed out an important truth to Peter after meeting Mickey. Brian reminded Peter that while Francis was not Peter's biological father, Francis had raised Peter as though he were his own son. Francis knew Peter was not his biological child, yet Francis still took on the responsibility of being Peter's father figure. This demonstrated that Francis truly did love Peter in his own way, even if Francis never expressed that love warmly. Francis raised another man's child and treated Peter as his son despite the circumstances of Peter's conception. Peter accepted Brian's observation that Francis had loved him despite everything. However, Peter was still pleased to have met Mickey and learned about his biological heritage. Peter now understood that his alcoholism was genetic rather than purely a personal failing. Peter had inherited his drinking problem from Mickey McFinnigan. The extraordinary alcohol tolerance that allowed Peter to drink massive quantities without dying was passed down through McFinnigan DNA. The episode established several dark, canonical facts about Peter's alcoholism. Peter's drinking problem killed Francis Griffin. Peter was so drunk that he fell off a unicycle and crushed his father to death. Francis used his dying words to condemn Peter's drinking rather than offer forgiveness or love. Peter's alcoholism had destroyed his relationship with his stepfather and ultimately caused Francis's death. Peter's alcoholism was revealed to be hereditary. Mickey McFinnigan was a legendary drunk whose drinking abilities were famous throughout his community. Mickey passed his genetic predisposition for alcoholism to his son Peter. Peter inherited Mickey's extraordinary alcohol tolerance and capacity for drinking. This inheritance meant that Peter's drinking problem was not just behavioral, but biological. Peter was genetically programmed to be an alcoholic. Peter proved his paternity through drinking ability. The only way Mickey believed Peter was his son was by witnessing Peter's drinking capacity. Mickey accepted Peter as family specifically because Peter could drink as much as Mickey could. The shared alcoholism served as proof of their biological connection. In Mickey's culture and worldview, the ability to drink massive amounts of alcohol was an inherited trait that demonstrated family lineage. The episode treated alcoholism as both a curse and a source of pride. Francis condemned Peter for being a drunk and blamed alcohol for ruining Peter's life. Mickey celebrated drinking as an honorable distinction and accepted Peter because of his drinking abilities. The Irish village treated being the town drunk as a prestigious position. These contradictory attitudes toward alcoholism showed that Peter received mixed messages about whether his drinking was something to be ashamed of or proud of. Peter's immediate replacement of alcohol with crack cocaine demonstrated that he had a fundamental addiction problem rather than specifically an alcohol problem. When Peter gave up drinking, he did not become sober. He simply switched to a different intoxicating substance. Peter's brain was wired for addiction regardless of the specific drug. The quick transition from alcohol to crack showed that substance abuse was Peter's default coping mechanism for any emotional distress. The generational pattern of alcoholism was clearly established. Mickey was a drunk, Peter was a drunk. Both men showed the same behavioral patterns and extraordinary alcohol tolerance. Peter learned that his drinking problem came from his father, just as any other genetic trait would pass from parent to child. The McFinnigan family lineage included alcoholism as an inherited characteristic. Peter's relationship with Frances was permanently destroyed by alcohol. Frances raised Peter despite knowing he was not Peter's biological father. Frances likely resented Peter for being evidence of Thelma's infidelity. Frances's final words condemned Peter's drinking, suggesting that Frances viewed alcohol as the defining aspect of Peter's character and the source of all his failings. Peter killed Frances through drunken negligence and received only condemnation rather than forgiveness. Peter's relationship with Mickey was founded entirely on shared alcoholism. Mickey only accepted Peter after Peter proved his drinking abilities. Their bond was based on their mutual capacity for consuming alcohol. The song they sang together celebrated their drunken relationship. Peter found acceptance from his biological father specifically because he was also an alcoholic. Mickey would not have welcomed Peter if Peter had been sober or a light drinker. The episode framed alcoholism as Peter's inheritance from Mickey McFinnigan. Peter learned that he was biologically predisposed to be a drunk, just like his father. The extraordinary alcohol tolerance that allowed both Peter and Mickey to drink massive amounts without dying was genetic. This meant Peter's alcoholism was not entirely his fault or choice. Peter inherited a biological tendency toward excessive drinking from his father. The deaths of both Frances and Mickey left Peter without a father figure. Peter accidentally killed Frances through drunk behavior. Frances died calling Peter a fat, stinking drunk. Peter found Mickey and formed a connection through drinking. Mickey immediately died from poisoned beer before he and Peter could develop a real relationship. Peter was left with no living father, and the knowledge that alcohol was central to his relationship with both men. Peter's alcoholism was canonically established as a genetic condition passed from Mickey McFinnigan to his son. Peter proved his paternity through drinking ability. Mickey accepted Peter as family only because Peter inherited Mickey's alcohol tolerance. The episode treated alcoholism as both a mark of shame that killed Frances and a source of pride that connected Peter to his biological heritage. Peter learned that being a fat, stinking drunk was his genetic destiny as a McFinnigan. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Peter's exploitation and betrayal of friends, neighbors, and entire communities. Peter Griffin's pattern of exploiting friends, neighbors, and entire communities for personal gain began in the very first episode of Family Guy and continued throughout the series. From committing welfare fraud that defrauded taxpayers of hundreds of thousands of dollars to humiliating his closest friends for entertainment after winning the lottery, Peter demonstrated a willingness to betray anyone for his own benefit. These acts of exploitation were not isolated incidents, but part of a consistent character pattern where Peter prioritized his own desires over the well-being of others. The show's critics frequently highlighted these storylines as some of the worst moral lessons the series promoted, depicting a protagonist who faced minimal consequences for systematically taking advantage of vulnerable people and government systems. The pilot episode Death Has a Shadow established Peter as someone willing to commit fraud against the government and lie to his family. Peter attended his friend's bachelor party despite promising his wife Lois that he would not drink alcohol. Peter broke this promise immediately and participated in drinking games at the party. He drank so much that he developed a severe hangover the next day. Peter went to work at the happy-go-lucky toy factory while still intoxicated from the previous night's drinking. Peter worked as a safety inspector at the toy factory. His job required him to examine toys on the assembly line and remove any dangerous items before they reached children. Peter's hangover was so severe that he fell asleep while sitting at his inspection station. While Peter slept, extremely dangerous objects passed through the assembly line unchecked. These dangerous items included a butcher knife, a surge protector, a gasoline can, razor blades, a porcupine, a toaster with forks stuck inside it, and an electrical plug designed for use in water. All of these items were packaged as children's toys and shipped to stores. Children across the country purchased these dangerous products and were injured by them. The happy-go-lucky toy factory received massive amounts of bad press when the media reported on children being harmed by unsafe toys. Peter's employer, Mr. Weed, fired Peter for his gross negligence that endangered children. Peter had allowed weapons and hazardous materials to be sold as toys because he was too drunk to do his job properly. Peter returned home and told his family he had been fired. Peter then began searching for new employment, but failed at every job interview. He auditioned to be the Cocoa Puffs mascot, but could not correctly deliver the simple advertising slogan even after 25 attempts. Peter's attempts to find work were unsuccessful because he lacked basic competence and work ethic. Brian suggested that Peter should think about his family's welfare. The word welfare gave Peter an idea. Peter decided to apply for government welfare assistance, even though he was not eligible for such benefits. Peter went to the welfare office and submitted an application for public assistance. A processing error at the welfare office created checks worth $150,000 per week instead of the normal welfare amount. This was obviously a massive mistake by the government system. Peter received his first welfare check for $150,000. Peter immediately recognized this was far more money than any welfare recipient should receive. Peter knew the government had made an error. The ethical and legal thing to do would have been to report the mistake and return the money. Instead, Peter decided to keep the fraudulently obtained funds and exploit the error for as long as possible. Peter lied to Lois about where the money came from. Peter told Lois that he had received a big raise at work. Peter did not mention that he had been fired or that the money came from welfare fraud. Lois believed Peter's lie and thought the family's financial situation had improved dramatically. Peter's deception prevented Lois from stopping the fraud or reporting the error to authorities. Peter spent the fraudulently obtained welfare money on absurd and extravagant purchases. Peter rented the statue of David's sculpture. Peter paid for cosmetic surgery for his daughter Meg, getting her collagen injections to make her smile bigger. Peter built a moat around the Griffin house to protect the family from the Black Knight. Peter's spending showed complete disregard for the fact that he was stealing taxpayer money that was meant to help genuinely needy families. The mail carrier eventually delivered a welfare check directly to Lois instead of Peter. Lois opened the envelope and discovered that Peter had been receiving welfare payments. Lois realized Peter had lied about getting a raise and had instead been committing welfare fraud. Lois confronted Peter about the deception. Peter admitted he had been lying about his employment and the source of their income. Peter decided to return the money to taxpayers by dumping it from a blimp during Super Bowl '83. Peter and Brian flew a blimp over the Super Bowl stadium with hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. They opened the blimp and dropped the money onto the field during the game. This created massive chaos at the Super Bowl as people scrambled to grab the falling cash. The authorities immediately shot down the blimp. Peter and Brian were arrested. Peter was charged with welfare fraud and brought to trial. The judge heard evidence that Peter had knowingly accepted welfare payments he was not entitled to receive. Peter had collected these fraudulent payments for weeks, stealing massive amounts of money from government programs meant to help poor families. The judge found Peter guilty of welfare fraud. The judge sentenced Peter to 24 months in prison for his crime. Lois stood up in court and begged the judge not to send Peter to prison. Lois said that despite Peter's terrible behavior, she loved him and would stand by her husband no matter what. The judge responded by sending Lois to prison as well for defending Peter's fraud. Baby Stewie then used his mind control device to force the judge to release Peter and give him his job back. Peter returned home after avoiding prison through Stewie's illegal mind control. Peter stated that he had learned his lesson and would never commit welfare fraud again. However, Peter immediately revealed he had learned nothing. Peter announced he was going to pursue other forms of fraud and exploitation. Peter said he would try to obtain a minority scholarship despite not being a minority. Peter said he would file a sexual harassment lawsuit even though he had not been harassed. Peter said he would file a disability claim despite not being disabled. Peter had no intention of behaving ethically and was already planning his next scams to exploit systems meant to help vulnerable people. The welfare fraud from the pilot episode established Peter's fundamental character. He would steal from anyone, lie to everyone including his wife, and feel no remorse about exploiting government assistance meant for people in genuine need. Peter defrauded taxpayers of hundreds of thousands of dollars and endangered the Super Bowl by dropping cash from a blimp. His only punishment was a brief arrest before his baby used science fiction technology to free him. Peter learned that he could commit serious crimes and face no real consequences. Peter's exploitation of his closest friends reached its peak in the season 10 premiere episode, Lottery Fever. The episode began with Peter asking Lois for money to open a sushi restaurant. Lois refused because the family was running low on cash and needed to stick to a strict budget. Peter was frustrated by this financial constraint and wanted a way to obtain large amounts of money quickly. The state lottery reached a jackpot of $150 million. Peter decided this was his opportunity to solve the family's money problems. Despite having no money to spend on lottery tickets, Peter found a way to purchase them. Peter obtained a second mortgage on the family home. Peter took out this loan against the house and used all the borrowed money to buy 200,000 lottery tickets. Peter gambled the family's home on lottery tickets without discussing this decision with Lois or considering what would happen if he lost. Brian sorted through all the lottery tickets to check if any were winners. Brian tormented the family by pulling out 400,000 fake losing tickets before finally drawing a genuine winning ticket. The Griffin family had won $150 million in the lottery. Peter had successfully gambled away the family home equity and won a massive fortune. Lois suggested that the family should not let the money go to their heads. Lois wanted the family to remain humble and grounded despite their newfound wealth. Peter ignored Lois's advice completely. Peter immediately quit his job at the Pawtucket Brewery. Peter spent his time drinking at the Drunken Clam instead of working or spending time with his family. Peter's friends, Quagmire and Joe, approached Peter at the Drunken Clam to ask for financial help. Quagmire asked Peter for a loan to invest in a business opportunity. Joe asked Peter for money to buy a birthday gift for his wife, Bonnie. These were reasonable requests from close friends who wanted to borrow small amounts of money. Peter agreed to give them the loans they requested. Peter gave Quagmire money to invest in a penis enlargement pill business. Peter gave Joe money to buy a gift for Bonnie. After providing these loans, Peter made his friends feel guilty when they tried to leave the bar. Peter insisted that Quagmire and Joe stay and spend time with him. Peter used the fact that he had given them money as leverage to control their behavior and demand their company. Peter's treatment of his friends rapidly deteriorated. Peter began throwing his weight around and making increasingly unreasonable demands. Peter treated Quagmire and Joe as though they were his servants or employees rather than his friends. Peter believed that giving them money meant he owned them and could make them do whatever he wanted. Peter forced Joe to bring him the first season of the television show True Blood because Peter wanted to see actress Anna Paquin's breasts. Joe complied with this demand and showed Peter the show. Peter then shouted at Joe for not knowing that Anna Paquin's nudity did not count as real nudity in Peter's opinion. Peter screamed at actress Anna Paquin herself for being on what he considered a terrible show. Peter was verbally abusive to Joe for following Peter's own instructions. Peter commanded Quagmire to take a huge bite out of a frozen popsicle. Quagmire bit into the popsicle as ordered. The frozen dessert caused Quagmire severe pain in his mouth and teeth. Peter found Quagmire's agony entertaining. Peter then threw the popsicle at Quagmire's head to further humiliate him. Peter's ultimate act of cruelty toward his friends came when he forced them to perform a musical duet for his entertainment. Peter made Quagmire and Joe sing the song Mockin' Whoopee while he watched. During their performance, Peter shot at them repeatedly with a BB gun. Quagmire and Joe begged Peter to stop shooting them. They specifically asked Peter to avoid shooting them in the face. Peter responded to this reasonable request by deliberately shooting Joe directly in the eye. The BB gun pellet struck Joe's eyeball and caused permanent damage. Joe would later need to get a glass eye to replace the one Peter destroyed. Peter intentionally shot his disabled friend in the face after being explicitly asked not to do so. Peter found inflicting this injury hilarious rather than horrifying. Quagmire began to protest Peter's treatment of them. Before Quagmire could finish his complaint, Peter shot Quagmire in the throat. The BB gun pellet struck Quagmire's throat and caused him pain. Peter shot Quagmire specifically to silence his objections to being abused. Peter was using violence to prevent his friends from standing up for themselves. Quagmire and Joe finally had enough of Peter's abuse. They told Peter they were ending their friendship with him. They explained that Peter had become cruel and abusive after winning the lottery. Peter had transformed from a friend into a bully who took pleasure in humiliating and physically harming them. Quagmire and Joe walked out of the Drunken Clam and severed all ties with Peter. Peter felt no remorse about shooting Joe in the eye or any of his other abusive behavior. Peter believed Quagmire and Joe should be grateful that he had shared any lottery money with them at all. Peter thought giving them loans meant they should tolerate any treatment he wanted to inflict on them. Peter got offended when his friends dared to complain about being shot and humiliated. He did not care when they ended their friendship because he was too self-absorbed to value relationships. Lois expressed concern that the lottery money was changing Peter for the worse. Lois could see that Peter was becoming more cruel and narcissistic. Peter responded by giving Lois an enormous blood diamond ring. Blood diamonds are harvested by murderous rebels who exploit and kill workers in conflict zones. Peter specifically chose to give Lois a blood diamond to show how much he did not care about human suffering. Peter won Lois over with this gift despite knowing it came from violence and exploitation. The Griffin family went to a restaurant for lunch. Peter attempted to pay with his credit card but discovered the card was declined. The family had spent all $150 million in lottery winnings in a single month. Peter's extravagant and thoughtless spending had bankrupted the family despite winning a massive fortune. The Griffins had lost everything. Peter discovered another winning lottery ticket among the family's belongings. They won the lottery a second time. Peter immediately spent all of this second fortune just as quickly as the first. The family went broke again within days. Peter had proven completely incapable of managing money or showing any financial responsibility whatsoever. Lois convinced Peter to apologize to Joe and Quagmire. Peter went to the Drunken Clam and told his former friends that he would be living in a cardboard box because he lost everything. Peter apologized for his abusive behavior and admitted the money had caused him to forget who his real friends were. Quagmire and Joe accepted Peter's apology despite Peter having shot Joe's eye out and terrorized them both. Quagmire revealed that the business investment Peter had given him actually paid off successfully. Quagmire wrote Peter a check for the profits from the penis enlargement pill company. This money was enough to save the Griffin house from foreclosure. Quagmire had become wealthy from Peter's loan and used that wealth to rescue Peter from homelessness. Quagmire helped Peter despite Peter having shot him in the throat and treated him like a slave. The episode rewarded Peter's terrible behavior by having his abused friend save him financially. The Lottery Fever episode demonstrated Peter's pattern of exploiting anyone he had power over. The moment Peter had money, he used it as a weapon to control and abuse his friends. Peter derived pleasure from making Quagmire and Joe perform humiliating tasks. Peter deliberately shot Joe in the eye for entertainment. Peter believed giving someone money meant he could treat them however he wanted. Peter showed no empathy or remorse until he needed his friends to save him from the consequences of his own spending. Peter's exploitation extended to his immediate neighbor Joe Swanson in multiple episodes. In No Meals on Wheels, Peter banned Joe and other wheelchair users from Peter's restaurant purely because Peter thought disabled people were not cool enough. Peter discriminated against his best friend based on physical disability. In the Book of Joe, Peter became power-hungry after taking credit for a book Joe had written. Peter tried to steal Joe's accomplishments and fame. In Papa Has a Rollin' Son, Peter actually tried to steal Joe's entire life and replace him. Peter founded his own country called Pretoria in the episode E Peterbus Unum. Peter discovered that his house was not technically part of the United States due to a property line error. Rather than simply reporting this to authorities, Peter declared his house to be an independent nation. Peter made himself president of Pretoria and claimed diplomatic immunity from U.S. laws. Peter immediately abused his new power by annexing his neighbor Joe's swimming pool. Peter declared the pool to be Praetorian territory and took it for himself without permission. Peter effectively stole his disabled friend's pool by claiming it belonged to Peter's made-up country. Peter invited dictators from around the world to visit his house. Peter waged war against the United States government. Peter's only punishment for creating an illegal nation and stealing from his neighbor was having to disband Pretoria and rejoin America. Peter exploited his intellectual disability diagnosis after testing with an IQ of 70 in the episode Petarded. Peter discovered that being classified as mentally challenged meant people would excuse his behavior. Peter deliberately exploited his disability status to get away with crimes and inappropriate actions. Peter kicked open women's bathroom stalls while women were using them. When women screamed at him for being a pervert, Peter claimed he was mentally challenged and the women apologized. Peter yelled the word testicles over restaurant loudspeakers. Peter committed these acts specifically because he knew his disability classification would protect him from consequences. Peter's exploitation of vulnerable populations appeared throughout the series. Peter discriminated against wheelchair users at his restaurant. Peter exploited government welfare systems meant to help poor families. Peter used his intellectual disability diagnosis to sexually harass women and disturb the peace. Peter stole from his neighbors by claiming their property for his fake country. Peter abused his friends after winning the lottery, shooting them and forcing them to perform degrading acts. The show's handling of these storylines troubled many critics who noted that Peter rarely faced meaningful consequences for his exploitation. After committing welfare fraud that stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from taxpayers, Peter avoided prison through supernatural intervention and immediately planned new fraud schemes. After shooting Joe in the eye and terrorizing his friends with a BB gun, Peter was forgiven and even financially rescued by the friend he had abused. After banning disabled people from his restaurant, Peter only learned his lesson when he temporarily became disabled himself. These patterns of exploitation demonstrated that Peter would betray anyone for personal gain. Peter betrayed his wife Lois by lying about losing his job and committing fraud. Peter betrayed taxpayers by stealing welfare money meant for needy families. Peter betrayed his closest friends Joe and Quagmire by treating them as servants and shooting them for entertainment. Peter betrayed his neighbor by stealing his pool. Peter betrayed vulnerable women by exploiting his disability status to commit sexual harassment. Peter's exploitation was not limited to individuals, but extended to entire systems and communities. The welfare fraud harmed every taxpayer who funded government assistance programs. The dangerous toys Peter let through quality control harmed children across the country who purchased them. The chaos Peter caused at the Super Bowl endangered thousands of spectators. Peter's pattern was to take advantage of any system, person, or situation he could exploit, regardless of who got hurt. The show often played Peter's exploitation for comedy rather than treating it as serious wrongdoing. The welfare fraud was presented as a wacky scheme rather than a serious crime that harmed vulnerable people. Peter shooting Joe in the eye was animated for laughs rather than shown as assault with lasting consequences. Peter's discrimination against disabled people was treated as an absurd premise rather than hate-based exclusion. Critics noted that these storylines sent troubling messages about accountability and consequences. Peter committed welfare fraud, discrimination, assault, and theft throughout the series, but remained the protagonist who the audience was meant to root for. His friends continued forgiving him despite repeated betrayals. Systems he exploited rarely caught him or punished him meaningfully. When Peter did face consequences, they were quickly resolved through plot devices like Stewie's mind control or Quagmire's business success. The exploitation and betrayal were consistent character traits rather than occasional aberrations. From the pilot episode onward, Peter demonstrated willingness to lie, cheat, steal, and harm others for his own benefit. Peter exploited his family by lying to Lois about his employment. Peter exploited the government by committing welfare fraud. Peter exploited his friends by using money as leverage to control and abuse them. Peter exploited his disability status to escape accountability. Peter exploited his neighbor's property by annexing it into his fake country. These acts of exploitation revealed Peter's fundamental selfishness and lack of empathy. Peter did not consider how his welfare fraud harmed families in genuine need. Peter did not consider how his discrimination hurt disabled members of his community. Peter did not consider how being shot in the eye affected Joe's life. Peter thought only about what he could gain and what he could get away with. His pattern of exploitation showed a character willing to betray anyone and harm any community if it served his immediate desires. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Peter as a canonical villain protagonist in his own universe. Peter Griffin has been officially classified as a villain, protagonist across multiple character databases and compilations, with his extensive criminal record documented to include mass murder, domestic abuse, assault, terrorism, arson, fraud, and dozens of other serious offenses. The Villains Wiki, Antagonist Wiki, and Incredibly Cruel Wiki all list Peter as a villainous protagonist whose crimes range from accidental patricide to deliberate mass murder of children. These classifications are based on canonical events from Family Guy episodes where Peter committed documented crimes that would result in life imprisonment or death sentences in the real world. Peter's transformation from a well-meaning but foolish father in early seasons to a malicious, psychopathic criminal who shows no remorse for his actions has cemented his status as someone who, by any objective standard, functions as a full-blown villain within his own universe. The official villain database listings for Peter Griffin contain staggering criminal records. The documented crimes include mass murder, mass manslaughter, torture, arson, domestic abuse, breaking and entering, mass property damage, assault and battery, home invasion, fraud, privacy violation, reckless driving, gross negligence, supplying drugs, endangerment, identity theft, incrimination, indecent exposure, serial rape, incest, prostitution, possession of child pornography, kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, driving under the influence, theft, blackmail, hostage-taking, hate crimes, conspiracy, smuggling, fabrication, defamation, perjury, slander, stalking, treason, corruption, pollution, sexual harassment, death threats, cannibalism, jailbreak, evading arrest, public humiliation, terrorism, aiding and abetting, unsportsmanlike conduct, supplying alcohol to minors, and zoophilia. This list represents canonical actions Peter committed throughout the series, not hypothetical scenarios or exaggerations. Each crime corresponds to specific episodes where Peter engaged in these behaviors. Peter's domestic abuse of his family members is extensively documented across multiple episodes. Peter has been physically violent toward his wife Lois, striking her, pushing her, and subjecting her to dangerous situations. Peter's systematic abuse of his daughter Meg includes thousands of documented incidents of physical violence, emotional torture, verbal abuse, and deliberate humiliation. Peter admitted in the episode Peter's Sister that he learned this abusive behavior from his own childhood, where his sister Karen bullied him while their parents stood by and watched. Peter perpetuated this cycle of abuse by making Meg the family's designated victim, someone everyone was encouraged to mock and harm. The abuse extends beyond Meg to all family members. Peter has been shown burning family members with cigars in the vision. Death showed him of his future alcoholic self. Peter threw Stewie's unconscious body behind Lois's car while she was backing up, nearly causing her to run over their infant son. Peter has locked Lois in the trunk of a car and pushed the vehicle into a lake, nearly drowning her. Peter sprayed Lois with a hose while she was in the bathroom until she fell down the stairs. These acts of domestic violence were not portrayed as accidents, but as deliberate choices Peter made to harm his family members. Peter's mass murder charges stem from multiple canonical incidents. The hospital bombing in Tales of a Third Grade Nothing resulted in 19 children dying when Peter detonated explosives next to a children's hospital. Peter showed no remorse for these deaths and only cared about how the bombing affected his job promotion. Peter received a mere 7 days in prison for murdering 19 pediatric patients. Demonstrating the universe's complete failure to hold him accountable for mass homicide, Peter went on a killing spree in the episode Brian's Play, murdering 3 children after Brian replaced Peter's margarine with real butter. This killing spree was a deliberate act of revenge for a minor annoyance. Peter murdered 3 children over butter. The show confirmed these were actual murders, not accidents or misunderstandings. Peter killed children in cold blood and faced no consequences. Peter also deliberately pushed a child in front of Lois's car in No Country Club for Old Men, just so Peter could retrieve Stewie's harmonica that was stuck in his own butt. Peter sacrificed a child's life for a trivial personal convenience. Peter's patricide, while accidental, still resulted from his drunken negligence. Peter fell off a unicycle while performing drunk at Meg's birthday party and crushed his stepfather Francis Griffin to death. Peter's intoxication and reckless behavior directly caused Francis's death by crushing his ribs, rupturing his spleen, and puncturing his lung. Francis died in the hospital with his final words condemning Peter as a fat, stinking drunk. Peter killed his own father through alcohol-fueled negligence and faced no criminal charges. Peter's terrorism charges come from multiple incidents. Peter founded the illegal nation of Pretoria and waged war against the United States government. Peter's actions constituted acts of war and treason against his country. Peter bombed a children's hospital, which meets the legal definition of terrorism, as using violence against civilians to achieve political or personal goals. Peter hijacked a blimp during the Super Bowl and dropped welfare money onto the field, creating mass chaos and endangering thousands of spectators. Each of these incidents qualifies as terrorism under federal law. Peter's arson record includes burning down multiple buildings and properties. Peter accidentally burned down Cleveland's house when trying to apologize, though Peter's clumsiness with fire was the direct cause. Peter has set numerous other fires throughout the series, causing massive property damage and endangering lives. The property damage Peter caused extends far beyond arson to include destruction of vehicles, buildings, public infrastructure, and private property. The total value of property Peter destroyed across the series would amount to millions of dollars. Peter's sexual crimes form one of the most disturbing aspects of his criminal record. Peter has been documented possessing child pornography in at least 2 episodes. In the 2,000-year-old virgin, Peter threw his laptop into the ocean to prevent discovery of illegal content. In He's Black, the show implied Peter possessed photographs of underage boys. These are serious federal crimes that carry mandatory minimum prison sentences of 15 years in the real world. The show treated Peter's possession of child pornography as a throwaway joke, rather than addressing the severity of these crimes. Peter attempted to commit incest with his son Chris in the episode Fresh Air. Peter tried to marry Chris to gain access to the Pewterschmidt family fortune. Peter killed an innocent child to create a romantic atmosphere for proposing to his own son. Peter used his wife's wedding ring to propose marriage to Chris. The episode portrayed Peter attempting to enter a sexual relationship with his underage son for money. This constitutes attempted incest, attempted child sexual abuse, and financial exploitation of a minor. Peter has committed multiple rapes according to the show's own canon. The serial rape classification in villain databases refers to incidents where Peter engaged in sexual acts without consent or with individuals unable to consent. Peter's sexual harassment of women is documented across dozens of episodes. Peter has grabbed women inappropriately, made unwanted sexual advances, exposed himself indecently, and created hostile environments for women in his workplace and community. Peter's fraud extends beyond the welfare fraud from the pilot episode. Peter has committed identity theft by impersonating other people. Peter has engaged in insurance fraud, tax fraud, and various financial scams. Peter has forged documents and fabricated evidence. Each of these constitutes separate felony charges that carry prison sentences. Peter's welfare fraud alone resulted in stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from government programs meant to help impoverished families. Peter's kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment charges come from episodes where Peter held people against their will. Peter has taken hostages during various schemes. Peter has imprisoned people in rooms or vehicles, preventing their escape. Peter has physically restrained individuals without legal authority. Each incident of false imprisonment constitutes a separate felony charge regardless of how long the imprisonment lasted. Peter's hate crimes include his discrimination against disabled people in No Meals on Wheels. Peter banned wheelchair users from his restaurant specifically because of their disability status. Peter called disabled people uncool and treated them as inferior. This discrimination based on disability status qualifies as a hate crime under federal law. Peter's shooting of Cleveland Jr. was investigated as a hate crime, though the episode ultimately concluded Peter's motive was stupidity rather than racism. Peter's drug-related crimes include supplying drugs to others and possessing illegal substances. Peter smoked crack cocaine in Peter's two dads after Francis died. Peter has provided alcohol to minors on multiple occasions. Peter has distributed other controlled substances throughout the series. Each instance of drug possession or distribution constitutes a separate criminal charge. Peter's drunk driving incidents are too numerous to count comprehensively. Peter has driven under the influence hundreds of times across the series. Peter's drunk driving directly caused his death and friends of Peter G. when he crashed into a tree. Peter attended his own daughter's school events while visibly intoxicated. Peter drove drunk with his children in the vehicle on multiple occasions. Each drunk driving incident is a separate criminal offense that endangers everyone on the road. Peter's assault and battery charges extend beyond his family to encompass hundreds of victims. Peter has physically attacked strangers, co-workers, friends, and authority figures. Peter brutally beat a 13-year-old boy named Kyle in the Tan Aquatic with Steve Zissou. While the boy had been bullying Chris, Peter's response was wildly disproportionate. Peter attacked the child with extreme violence, causing serious injuries. Peter showed brief remorse for this assault, making it one of the rare occasions where Peter acknowledged his violence was wrong. Peter shot his friends Joe and Quagmire with a BB gun in Lottery Fever, deliberately shooting Joe in the eye after being specifically asked to avoid the face. Peter permanently damaged Joe's eye, requiring Joe to get a glass eye replacement. Peter shot Quagmire in the throat to silence his complaints. These were deliberate assaults with a weapon against Peter's closest friends. Peter found inflicting these injuries entertaining rather than disturbing. Peter's animal cruelty includes multiple incidents of harming animals. Peter attempted to shave Quagmire's cat with a straight razor, causing hideous injuries to the animal. Peter continued mutilating the cat because he falsely believed cats had 9 lives. Peter's ignorance did not excuse the deliberate harm he inflicted on a defenseless animal. Peter has harmed other animals throughout the series through negligence, deliberate violence, or cruel pranks. Peter's classification as a villain protagonist, rather than a hero who sometimes makes mistakes, stems from the show's own treatment of his character. The villain databases note that Peter was originally presented as a morally ambiguous anti-hero in early seasons. Peter was oafish, impulsive, ignorant, and inconsiderate, but he had good intentions and genuinely cared about his family. However, starting around season 8, Peter transformed into something far darker. Peter became malicious, evil, psychopathic, and immature. Peter began helping others purely for personal gain rather than genuine altruism. Peter engaged in illegal actions without hesitation or remorse. The transformation was so dramatic that critics and fans began openly hating Peter for becoming a shell of his former self. The well-meaning but foolish father was replaced by someone who committed atrocities and laughed about them. Peter showed little to no remorse for any of his crimes. When Peter accidentally blew up the children's hospital and killed 19 young patients, Peter downplayed the entire incident and only cared that the billboard he targeted had been destroyed. Peter's complete lack of empathy for the dead children demonstrated his psychopathic nature. Peter's hypocrisy compounds his villainy. Peter frequently calls out other villains in Family Guy for their bad deeds, despite Peter having committed far worse actions himself. Peter condemns others for behavior that pales in comparison to Peter's own crimes. Peter murdered children but lectures others about morality. Peter abuses his family but criticizes others for mistreating their loved ones. Peter's inability to recognize his own villainy makes him even more dangerous because he genuinely believes his actions are justified or acceptable. Peter's intellectual disability diagnosis with an IQ around 70 does not excuse his crimes legally or morally. Peter demonstrated in Petarded that he was aware of what he was doing when he exploited his disability status. Peter deliberately used his classification as intellectually disabled to escape consequences for criminal behavior. Peter kicked open women's bathroom stalls and claimed he did not know better, but Peter clearly understood he was violating women's privacy and only said he was disabled after being caught. Peter's exploitation of his diagnosis proved he had the mental capacity to understand right from wrong and choose to do wrong anyway. The show's universe consistently fails to hold Peter accountable for his crimes. Peter murdered 19 children and received 7 days in prison. Peter committed welfare fraud, stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars and escaped prison through supernatural mind control. Peter shot his friend's eye out and was forgiven without facing charges. Peter discriminated against disabled people and only learned his lesson temporarily when he became disabled himself. Peter founded an illegal nation and went to war with the United States, but was simply told to rejoin America with no punishment. This pattern of non-accountability transforms Peter from a criminal who gets caught to a villain who operates with impunity. Peter learned through repeated experience that he could commit any crime and face minimal or no consequences. This encouraged Peter to escalate his criminal behavior because he knew he would not be held responsible. Peter became more violent, more cruel, and more destructive because the universe rewarded his villainy by allowing him to escape justice. The villain classifications for Peter note that he is severely depressed despite his outward behavior. Peter has expressed his unhappiness to Lois multiple times. This depression does not excuse Peter's crimes, but may explain why Peter engages in increasingly extreme behavior, seeking some form of stimulation or meaning. Peter's depression combined with his intellectual disability, alcoholism, and lack of consequences creates a perfect storm for villainous behavior. Peter's treatment of Meg exemplifies his domestic abuse and qualifies him as a villain. Peter has shown no regard for Meg's safety, abandoning her in dangerous situations. Peter deliberately exposed Meg to mumps because he did not love her enough to vaccinate her. Peter sold Meg to another family. Peter spent Meg's college fund on frivolous purchases. Peter asked God to erase Meg from existence. Peter handed the television remote to viewers during a Meg-focused episode and told the audience to change the channel. Peter's systematic dehumanization and abuse of his daughter demonstrates his capacity for sustained cruelty toward vulnerable family members. Peter openly admitted to hating his children because they were not entertaining to him. Peter views his own children as disappointments and burdens, rather than people he loves and should protect. This fundamental rejection of parental responsibility marks Peter as someone who should never have had children and who actively harms the children in his care. Peter's abuse of his children qualifies him as an unfit parent and a danger to minors. The canonical evidence establishes Peter Griffin as a villain protagonist whose crimes would result in multiple life sentences or execution in any functioning justice system. Peter's documented record includes 19 counts of murder from the hospital bombing, 3 counts of murder from his killing spree, 1 count of patricide, multiple counts of assault with a deadly weapon, multiple counts of child abuse, possession of child pornography, attempted incest with a minor, welfare fraud, terrorism, treason, arson, and hundreds of other criminal offenses. Peter has killed at least 23 people across documented incidents, not including death that may have occurred from his other reckless actions. Peter's classification in villain databases as a protagonist villain rather than an antagonist reflects the uncomfortable reality that Family Guy presents a domestic abuser, child murderer, and serial criminal as its main character. The audience is supposed to identify with and root for someone whose criminal record would make him one of the most dangerous criminals in American history. Peter is not an anti-hero who sometimes crosses ethical lines while ultimately doing good. Peter is a genuine villain whose rare moments of decency cannot outweigh the mountain of atrocities he has committed. The show's own universe implicitly acknowledges Peter's villain status through various meta-jokes and character reactions. Other characters frequently express horror at Peter's actions. Lois has expressed fear of Peter and recognition that he is dangerous. Brian has called out Peter's terrible behavior. Even Stewie, an infant with his own villainous tendencies, recognizes that Peter's treatment of the family is wrong. The universe knows Peter is a monster even if it refuses to punish him appropriately. Peter Griffin functions as a canonical villain protagonist whose extensive criminal record, documented domestic abuse, mass murder of children, terrorism, and complete lack of remorse establish him as someone who would be imprisoned or executed in any rational universe. The villain classifications in multiple databases reflect the accumulated evidence of Peter's crimes across hundreds of episodes. Peter is not a flawed hero or a lovable buffoon. Peter is a documented violent criminal whose actions have resulted in dozens of deaths, countless injuries, millions of dollars in property damage, and immeasurable psychological harm to his abuse victims. The uncomfortable truth about Family Guy is that its protagonist is, by any objective measure, one of the worst villains in television history. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.